Welcome to NightSleepWhisper. Tonight, we embark on a long journey to the fog-covered cliffs of Blue Island. You are about to hear the complete 50-chapter saga of Peter Miller and the secret of the weight of gold. Before we begin, I invite you to find your most comfortable position. Dim the lights, put on your headphones, and let the outside world fade away. Tonight's story is a mystery, but you don't need to stay awake to solve it. Let the sound of my voice guide you, and when sleep calls, feel free to let go. The story will continue in your dreams. The small wooden boat moved slowly across the blue water. The sun was high in the sky, and the air was warm. Peter sat on a hard bench at the back of the boat. He held the sides of the boat with both hands. His fingers were white because he held the wood very tightly. He was not a fan of the ocean, but he had a job to do. Peter was 35 years old. He was a journalist for a popular newspaper in the city. He usually wrote about small stories, like new parks or local festivals. But this trip was different. He was going to Blue Island to interview Mrs. Gable. She was a very famous woman who lived a private life. She rarely talked to the media. When she invited Peter, he was very surprised. The boat driver was an old man with a grey beard. He wore a yellow raincoat and a hat. He did not speak to Peter. He only looked forward at the horizon. The engine made a constant, heavy noise that filled the air. White foam appeared behind the boat as it pushed through the waves. The sea was calm today, but Peter still felt a little sick in his stomach. "Is the island far?" Peter asked the driver. The old man did not turn his head. He pointed a finger toward a small green spot in the distance. 10 minutes. The driver said. His voice was deep and dry. Peter looked at his leather bag. Inside the bag, he had a notebook, 3 pens, and a small camera. He wanted to ask Mrs. Gable many questions. Why did she move to a private island? Why did she stop talking to her friends? People said she had a big secret. Peter wanted to find that secret. The island became larger as they got closer. Peter saw tall green trees and sharp grey rocks. On top of a high cliff, there was a large white building. It was the hotel. It looked beautiful but very lonely. There were no other houses near it. There were no other boats on the water. Peter took a deep breath of the salty air. He tried to relax his shoulders. He told himself that this was just a normal interview. He was a professional journalist. However, a small voice in his head told him to be careful. Blue Island was far from the mainland. If he needed help, there was no one to call. The boat finally reached a small wooden dock. The driver stopped the engine. Suddenly, the world was very quiet. The only sound was the water hitting the wooden posts of the dock. Peter stood up and picked up his bag. His legs felt a bit weak. He stepped onto the dock and looked up at the white hotel on the hill. The mystery of Blue Island was waiting for him. Peter walked away from the wooden dock. The path to the hotel was steep and narrow. It was made of small white stones that moved under his feet. He carried his heavy bag over his shoulder. On both sides of the path, there were thick green bushes and tall trees. The air was quiet, except for the sound of birds in the trees and the wind in the leaves. Peter stopped for a moment to look back. The small boat was already moving away. He was now alone on the island. He continued his walk until he reached the top of the hill. The hotel was much larger than it looked from the boat. It was a grand building with 3 floors. The walls were painted a bright white, and the windows were tall and dark. There was a large wooden door at the front. Peter reached out and pushed the door open. It moved slowly. Inside, the lobby was very elegant. The floor was made of polished wood, and there were soft blue carpets in the center of the room. A large glass chandelier hung from the ceiling. It looked like 1,000 small diamonds. However, the room felt cold. There was no fire in the fireplace, and the air was very still. A tall man stood behind a high wooden desk. He wore a black suit and a white shirt. His hair was short and very neat. This was Mr. Green, the hotel manager. He did not look up when Peter approached the desk. He was writing something in a large book. "Hello," Peter said. "My name is Peter Miller. I have a reservation." Mr. Green stopped writing. He looked up at Peter. His eyes were a pale grey, and his face was very serious. He did not smile. He looked at Peter for a long time before he spoke. "Welcome to Blue Island, Mr. Miller," Mr. Green said. His voice was very formal. "We were expecting you. Mrs. Gable told me you were coming today." Mr. Green opened a drawer and took out a heavy silver key. It was attached to a small wooden block with the number 202 on it. He placed the key on the desk. "You are in the room on the second floor," Mr. Green continued. "It has a view of the sea. Dinner is at 7 o'clock in the dining room. Please do not be late. Mrs. Gable likes people to be on time." "Thank you," Peter said. He picked up the key. It felt cold in his hand. "Are there many other guests here?" Mr. Green stared at him. "There are 4 other guests, Mr. Miller. They are all friends of Mrs. Gable. Now, if you excuse me, I have work to do." Mr. Green picked up his pen and started writing again. He did not say anything else. Peter felt that the conversation was over. He took his bag and walked toward the stairs. He felt like someone was watching him. But when he turned around, Mr. Green was only looking at his book. Peter began to climb the stairs to his room. Peter reached the second floor. The hallway was long and the ceiling was high. The wooden floor made a soft noise as he walked. He found room 202 at the end of the hall. The silver key turned easily in the lock. The room was large and very clean. It had a big bed with a heavy blue blanket. There was a dark wooden desk and a single chair near the window. Peter walked to the window and looked out. He could see the beach and the sharp grey rocks below. The ocean water looked very dark and deep. He placed his bag on the bed and opened it. He felt a bit cold. The air in the room was fresh but chilly. He looked for a heater, but the room only had a small, empty fireplace. There was no wood or coal to start a fire. Peter decided to go back downstairs. He wanted to ask for a bottle of water and perhaps more information about Mrs. Gable's schedule. He walked quietly down the stairs. He did not want to make any noise. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw Mr. Green. The manager was not at the reception desk. He was standing in the middle of the hallway near a large painting of a ship. He was holding a small, folded piece of paper in his hand. He looked left and then right. He looked very worried. Mr. Green did not see Peter standing in the shadows of the stairs. The manager reached out and moved the painting of the ship slightly to the side. Behind the painting, there was a small square hole in the wall. Mr. Green put the piece of paper inside the hole very quickly. Then he moved the painting back to its original place. He touched his tie and took a deep breath. Peter stayed very still. He did not want Mr. Green to see him watching. Who was that paper for? Why did the manager need to hide a message? Peter waited for a full minute until Mr. Green walked back to the reception desk. The manager sat down and picked up his black pen. He looked like a calm, professional worker again. Peter finally walked into the lobby. He tried to look relaxed. "Excuse me, Mr. Green," he said with a small smile. Mr. Green looked up. His face was like a stone mask. "Yes, Mr. Miller. Is there a problem with your room?" "No. The room is very nice," Peter said. "I'm just a little thirsty after the boat trip. Can I get some water?" Mr. Green pointed to a small table in the corner of the lobby. There is a glass bottle of fresh water and some clean glasses over there. Please, help yourself. Thank you, Peter said. He walked to the table and poured a glass of water. He felt Mr. Green's eyes on his back the whole time. Has Mrs. Gable lived on this island for a long time? She bought this hotel 5 years ago. Mr. Green answered. She likes the silence here. She does not like many questions. Mr. Miller, you should remember that for your interview tomorrow. Peter nodded and drank the water. He wanted to look behind that painting, but he knew he had to be patient. Mr. Green was always watching. Peter went back to his room. He took out his notebook and wrote. Mr. Green hid a note behind the ship painting. Why? The mystery was starting already. The clock on the wall showed 7 o'clock. Peter put on a clean white shirt and a dark jacket. He wanted to look professional for his first meeting with Mrs. Gable. He left his room and walked down the stairs. The dining room was located on the ground floor, past the reception desk. The dining room was very beautiful. It had long blue curtains and a large rectangular table in the center. The table was covered with a white cloth. There were tall candles in silver holders, but they were not lit yet, for people were already sitting at the table. They were all adults, and they were talking in low voices. They stopped talking when Peter entered the room. Peter felt their eyes on him, but he just gave a small nod and took an empty seat near the end of the table. A few minutes later, a side door opened. A woman walked into the room. Everyone stood up immediately. It was Mrs. Gable. She was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. She wore a long, dark purple dress and a simple pearl necklace. She looked very elegant, but Peter noticed something else. Her face was very pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She looked like she had not slept for many days. Her hands moved nervously as she touched her necklace. Please, sit down, Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was thin and tired. She sat at the head of the table. I'm happy you are all here, and welcome to our guest, Mr. Miller. Thank you, Mrs. Gable, Peter said. It is an honor to meet you. Mrs. Gable looked at him for a second, but her eyes seemed to look through him. She was thinking about something else. She looked worried. She looked at the other guests, the doctor, the chef, and the pilot. They all watched her carefully. The room was very quiet. Peter could hear the sound of the wind outside the hotel walls. It was a lonely, whistling sound. We will eat first, Mrs. Gable said suddenly. We have much to discuss, but I am very tired tonight. Tomorrow morning, I have something important to tell you all. It is a secret I have kept for a long time. The guests looked at each other. The doctor, a man with glasses, cleared his throat but said nothing. The chef, who was wearing a white jacket, looked down at his empty plate. The atmosphere in the room was heavy. It felt like a storm was coming, even though the sky outside was clear. Mr. Green entered the room with a tray of food. He began to serve the guests in silence. Mrs. Gable did not eat much. She picked at her food with a fork. She looked at the windows frequently, as if she expected someone to appear in the darkness. Peter watched her. He had many questions, but he knew this was not the right time to ask them. He realized that Mrs. Gable was not just private. She was afraid. Peter looked around the table. He wanted to know more about the people sitting with him. To his left sat Dr. Aries. The doctor was a thin man with sharp eyes and small glasses. He wore a grey suit that looked very expensive. He did not eat quickly. He moved his spoon slowly and watched everyone. Are you a friend of Mrs. Gable, Dr. Aries? Peter asked. The doctor looked at Peter. I am her doctor. I have been her doctor for 10 years. I am also an old friend of her family. We have a long history together. He did not say anything more. He turned back to his soup. Across from Peter sat Marco. Marco was the hotel chef, but tonight he was a guest at the table. He was a large man with very big hands. He looked nervous. He kept looking at the door and then at his watch. He did not look like a man who enjoyed a party. "The food is very good, Marco," Peter said. "Thank you," Marco replied in a low voice. "I usually work in the kitchen. I do not usually sit here." But Mrs. Gable insisted. She wanted us all together tonight. Then there was Victor. Victor was a retired pilot. He had a strong face with many lines from the sun and the wind. He wore a brown leather jacket even though they were indoors. He looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. He was drinking his water quickly. "Do you still fly planes, Victor?" Peter asked. Victor shook his head. "No. My flying days are over. Now I just help Mrs. Gable with her supplies. I bring things from the mainland when she needs them." Peter noticed something strange. None of the guests looked at each other. They only looked at Mrs. Gable or at their own plates. It was a very quiet dinner. The only sounds were the forks hitting the plates and the wind outside the hotel. The wind was getting stronger. It made a low, whistling sound around the corners of the building. Mrs. Gable sat at the head of the table. She did not talk to her friends. She looked at the candles. The yellow light of the candles made long shadows on her face. Peter felt a strange energy in the room. These people were not just friends. They were people with a shared past. And that past did not seem happy. "It is a small group for such a big house," Peter said. "The island is small, but the secrets are big," Victor said suddenly. Dr. Aries looked at Victor with a cold expression. Victor stopped talking and looked down at the table. Peter wrote a mental note in his head. He needed to talk to Victor alone. These three men knew something, and they were all afraid of the same thing. The meal continued in silence. Mr. Green moved around the table like a shadow. He took the empty plates and brought a large silver bowl of fruit. No one touched the fruit. The air in the room felt heavy, like the air before a big storm. Peter looked at Mrs. Gable. She was staring at a single candle in the center of the table. Her eyes did not move. Suddenly, Mrs. Gable stood up. Her chair made a loud scraping sound on the wooden floor. Everyone stopped moving. Dr. Aries put down his wine glass. Marco's hands began to shake slightly. Victor looked at the ceiling. They all looked like they were waiting for bad news. "I invited you all here for a reason," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was stronger now, but it was cold. "We have known each other for a long time. We have shared many things. But there is one thing we do not talk about. We have lived with a lie for too long." She paused and looked at each person at the table. When her eyes met Peter's, she stopped for a second. "Mr. Miller is here to write my story. But he does not know the whole story yet. None of you do. You only know your own parts of the puzzle." Dr. Aries stood up too. He adjusted his glasses. "Eleanor, please. This is not the time. You are tired. You are not thinking clearly. We should all go to bed and talk when the sun is up." Mrs. Gable shook her head. "No, Doctor. The time for silence is over. Tomorrow morning, at 10 o'clock, I want everyone to meet me in the library. I have a secret to tell you. It is a secret from 20 years ago. It is a secret that involves all of you." A loud noise came from outside. The wind hit the side of the hotel with great force. The windows shook in their frames. Mrs. Gable did not look afraid. She looked relieved, as if a heavy weight was leaving her heart. 20 years ago," Victor whispered. His face was very pale. But we promised never to speak of that night. We agreed it was finished. Promises can be broken. Mrs. Gable replied. The truth is more important now. I cannot carry this weight anymore. I want to be able to sleep again. I will see you all in the morning. Do not be late. She turned and walked out of the room. She did not look back. Her long purple dress disappeared into the dark hallway. Peter heard her footsteps on the stairs, and then there was only the sound of the wind. The room remained silent for a long time. Peter watched the three men. Marco was breathing heavily. Dr. Aries was looking at the door with an angry expression. Victor was staring at his hands. Peter realized that the secret was something dangerous. These adults were not just friends. They were partners in something hidden. I think I will go to my room now, Marco said suddenly. He stood up and left the room quickly. He did not look at anyone. One by one, the others left too. Peter was the last person in the dining room. He looked at the candles. The flames were small and weak. He felt a cold chill on his neck. The story he came to write was much bigger and darker than he thought. Peter went back to his room on the second floor. The hallway was very dark now. The small lamps on the walls gave only a little yellow light. He closed his door and turned the key. He felt safer inside his room. But his mind was busy. He thought about Mrs. Gable and her secret. He thought about the angry face of Dr. Aries and the shaking hands of Marco the chef. What happened 20 years ago? The room was cold. The wind was very strong now, and it pushed against the large window. The glass made a low, vibrating sound. Peter sat on the edge of his bed. He took his notebook out of his bag. He wanted to write down everything he saw during dinner. As he reached for his pen, it rolled off the bed and fell onto the floor. It disappeared under the bed. Peter sighed and got down on his knees. He reached under the bed to find his pen. His fingers touched the cold wooden floor. He felt the pen, but he also felt something else. It was a piece of paper. It felt dry and rough, like old paper. He pulled his hand back. He had the pen, and he had a small, folded square of paper. He sat back on the floor and unfolded the paper. It was not a letter. It was a hand-drawn map. The ink was dark brown, and the paper was yellow with age. The drawing showed Blue Island. Peter recognized the shape of the island from the boat trip. In the center of the map, there was a square that represented the hotel. A thin, wavy line started at the back of the hotel. It went through a forest and ended at a tall tower on the edge of a cliff. The lighthouse. Peter whispered to himself. On the map, there were small words written in a very neat hand. Next to the lighthouse, someone had written, "The truth is here." Under the hotel, there was another note. "Be careful of the shadows." There was no name on the map. There was no date. Peter looked at the door. Had someone put this map here today? Or had it been under the bed for a long time? He remembered that Mr. Green was the manager. Mr. Green knew everything about the rooms. But Peter also thought about the note Mr. Green hid behind the painting. Perhaps the hotel was full of hidden messages. He walked to the window and looked out into the night. He could not see the lighthouse. It was too dark, and the rain was starting to hit the glass. The water moved down the window in long, thin lines. Peter felt a shiver of excitement. He was a journalist, and he loved a good mystery. Tomorrow morning, Mrs. Gable wanted to talk to everyone in the library. But maybe the real answer was not in the library. Maybe it was at the old lighthouse. He put the map inside his notebook and hid it under his pillow. He decided to go to bed, but he did not think he could sleep. The island felt like a giant puzzle, and he was right in the middle of it. The rain was now very heavy. It hit the roof of the hotel with a constant, loud rhythm. Peter lay in his bed, but he did not close his eyes. He watched the shadows of the trees move on the ceiling. Every time the wind blew, the old hotel made a low, groaning sound. It was the sound of old wood moving. Peter felt like the building was alive. He looked at the clock on his bedside table. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. He tried to think about his interview questions for Mrs. Gable, but his mind always went back to the map under his pillow. Who drew it? Why was it under his bed? And most importantly, what was at the lighthouse? Suddenly, Peter heard a different sound. It was not the wind, and it was not the rain. It was the sound of a foot stepping on the wooden floor in the hallway. The sound was very slow and very quiet. Someone was walking outside his room. Peter stayed perfectly still. He did not breathe. He listened with all his energy. After a few seconds, there was another step. Then another. The person was moving toward the stairs. Peter sat up in bed. He moved slowly so the bed would not make any noise. He stepped onto the cold floor and walked to the door. He put his ear against the heavy wood of the door. He could hear the sound of soft breathing on the other side. The person was standing right there, just outside room 202. Peter's heart beat fast in his chest. He felt a cold sweat on his forehead. He waited for a long time. Finally, the footsteps began to move again. They were moving away from his door and toward the end of the hallway. Peter looked through the large keyhole. The hallway was very dark, but he saw a small flash of light. It was the light of a torch. The light moved along the wall and then stopped at the door of the library. A tall shadow followed the light. The shadow was thin and wore a long coat. The person opened the library door very quietly and went inside. Peter wanted to follow, but he remembered the note on the map. Be careful of the shadows. He did not have a torch, and he did not know the house well. If he was caught, he would lose his chance to get the interview. He stood by the door for 10 minutes, but the person did not come out. The hotel was quiet again, except for the storm outside. Peter went back to his bed. He felt a deep sense of danger. Everyone on this island was keeping secrets. Mrs. Gable, the doctor, the chef, the pilot, and even the manager were all acting strangely. He realized that he was not just a journalist anymore. He was part of a mystery that was 20 years old. He finally fell asleep, but his dreams were full of dark water and hidden maps. Peter woke up late the next morning. The sky outside was grey and cloudy, but the heavy rain had stopped. He looked at the clock. It was 9 o'clock. He remembered the meeting in the library at 10 o'clock. He dressed quickly and went down to the dining room for breakfast. He hoped to find some coffee and perhaps some answers about the footsteps from the night before. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he did not hear the quiet silence of a hotel. Instead, he heard a loud, angry voice. It was Marco, the chef. He was standing in the middle of the lobby, and his face was very red. Mr. Green stood in front of him. The manager looked calm, but his hands were behind his back, squeezed tight. I am telling you, it is gone. Marco shouted. He hit the reception desk with his large hand. The sound of the impact was loud and sharp. Someone went into my room while I was sleeping. Please, Mr. Marco, lower your voice. Mr. Green said quietly. We have other guests. We will find it. Find it? How? Marco asked. He looked at Peter as he walked into the room. You. Journalist. Did you see anyone in the hallway last night? Peter stopped. He thought about the shadow and the torch. I heard some footsteps at 2 in the morning. Peter said honestly. But I did not see a face. What is missing? My camera. Marco said. He sounded like he wanted to cry. It is a very expensive camera. I use it for my work. I put it in my desk drawer before I went to bed. This morning, The drawer was open, and the camera was not there. Dr. Aries and Victor walked into the lobby. They heard the noise. The doctor looked annoyed. He checked his watch and then looked at Marco. "It is just a camera. Marco, perhaps you left it in the kitchen. You are always forgetful when you are tired." "No," Marco yelled. "I am a professional. I know where I put my tools. Someone took it because they do not want me to take pictures of this island. They are afraid of what the camera might see." Victor, the pilot, stayed near the door. He did not say a word. He looked at the floor. He looked even more tired than he did the night before. His hands were deep in his jacket pockets. "I will search the hotel," Mr. Green said. "But we must be ready for the meeting in the library. Mrs. Gable is waiting for us. A missing camera is a problem, but Mrs. Gable's secret is more important right now." Marco looked at the others with suspicion. He didn't trust anyone in the room. Peter felt the same way. The shadow he saw last night was moving toward the library, not the chef's room. Or was it? The hotel was full of many doors and many secrets. Peter touched the notebook in his pocket. He still had the map, but now someone else was stealing things. The island was becoming a very dangerous place. The clock in the lobby struck 10. The sound was deep and heavy. It echoed through the empty space. Peter, Dr. Aries, Marco, and Victor stood near the stairs. They were ready to go to the library to meet Mrs. Gable. Marco was still angry about his missing camera. He kept looking at everyone's pockets. The large front door of the hotel opened suddenly. Mr. Green walked inside. He was breathing very fast. His neat black suit was wet from the ocean mist, and his shoes were covered in sand. He did not go to his desk. He walked straight to the center of the group. "I have something to tell you," Mr. Green said. His voice was not formal anymore. It sounded thin and full of fear. "I went down to the dock to check the supply boat. I wanted to see if the driver was coming back early with the mail." "And?" Dr. Aries asked. He crossed his arms over his chest. "Is the boat coming?" Mr. Green shook his head. "The boat is already there, but it is not moving. The engine is destroyed. Someone used a heavy tool to break the metal. The wires are cut, and the fuel tank is empty. The fuel is all over the water." The room became very quiet. Peter felt a cold knot in his stomach. He looked at the faces of the other men. Marco looked like he was going to fall over. Victor closed his eyes and leaned against the wall. Dr. Aries just stared at Mr. Green. "What do you mean someone broke it?" Marco whispered. "Are you saying a person did this on purpose? The damage is not an accident." Mr. Green replied. "The engine was hit many times. It was a violent act. And that is not all. The radio in the boat is also smashed. We have no way to call the mainland. We have no way to leave this island. This is impossible." Dr. Aries shouted. "We are trapped here. For how long? The next supply boat is not scheduled for 3 days." Mr. Green said. "Until then, we are alone. The storm last night damaged the hotel's main telephone line too. We are completely cut off from the world." Peter thought about the shadow he saw last night. He thought about the map under his pillow. Someone on the island wanted to keep them here. Someone wanted to make sure no one could escape before Mrs. Gable told her secret. "We must tell Mrs. Gable," Peter said. "She is waiting in the library," Mr. Green said. He wiped his wet forehead with a handkerchief. "But I do not think she will be surprised. She knew something was going to happen. That is why she called us all here." The group moved toward the library doors. The wooden doors were tall and dark. Peter felt a sense of dread. The broken boat changed everything. They were not just guests anymore. They were prisoners on Blue Island, and the person who broke the boat was standing right there in the hallway with them. The group walked to the library. The doors were made of heavy, dark wood. Inside, the library was the largest room in the hotel. The walls were covered with thousands of books from the floor to the high ceiling. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and a little bit of perfume. In the center of the room, there was a long wooden table with 6 chairs. A large, expensive-looking chair with a tall back sat at the head of the table. It was empty. Dr. Aries sat down first. He looked at his gold watch and frowned. "It is 10 minutes past 10. He said. His voice was sharp and impatient. "Eleanor is never late. She is a woman of her word. She values time more than anything." Marco sat next to the doctor. He looked at the empty chair with a look of fear. "Maybe she is still in her room," the chef suggested. He wiped his hands on his trousers. "Maybe she heard about the broken boat and is too upset to speak." Victor did not sit down. He walked to the tall windows and looked out at the gray sky. "The storm is coming back," he said quietly. "Look at those clouds. They are dark and heavy. We are going to have a very long day." Peter took the seat across from Marco. He opened his notebook and held his pen ready. He wanted to write, but there was nothing to write yet. He looked at Mr. Green. The manager was standing by the door. He looked very uncomfortable. He moved his weight from one foot to the other and kept touching his tie. "Mr. Green," Peter said, "should you go and check on Mrs. Gable? She was very determined to talk to us this morning. It is strange that she is not here." Mr. Green nodded slowly. "Yes. Mr. Miller, you are right. This is not like her at all. She was very insistent about the time. She told me last night that this meeting was the most important event of the year." The room was very quiet. Peter could hear the slow, rhythmic sound of the grandfather clock in the corner. The metal weight inside the clock moved back and forth with a steady beat. Each second felt like a very long time. They waited for another 5 minutes. No one spoke. The atmosphere was thick with worry. Everyone was thinking about the broken boat and the smashed radio. They were trapped on this island with a big secret, and now the person with the secret was not there. "I will go to her suite," Mr. Green said. He started to walk toward the door. "Please, all of you stay here. I am sure she just overslept. The loud storm kept everyone awake last night." "I will come with you," Dr. Aries said. He stood up quickly. "I am her doctor. If she is feeling unwell or if she has fainted, I should be there to help." "No," Mr. Green said firmly. "Mrs. Gable is a very private woman. If she is in her room, she will want me to knock first. I will return in a moment. Please, wait." Mr. Green left the library and closed the doors. The remaining guests looked at each other. Peter looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. It looked very big and very lonely. The white light from the window made the chair look almost ghostly. "I do not like this," Marco whispered. "First my camera, then the boat, and now this. Something is very wrong on this island." Peter looked at his notes. He had many questions, but the most important one was, where was the woman who invited them here? The library doors opened again after 5 minutes. Mr. Green stood there, but he did not enter. His face was even paler than before. He held onto the door handle with a shaking hand. The other guests stood up at the same time. "She is not answering," Mr. Green said. He looked at Dr. Aries and then at Peter. "I knocked many times. I called her name. There was no sound from inside the room. The door is locked from the inside." Perhaps she is in a deep sleep. Dr. Aries said. He walked toward the door. Or perhaps she had a fall. As her doctor, I must see her. Mr. Green, lead the way. Peter picked up his notebook and followed them. Marco and Victor stayed in the library. They looked too afraid to move. Peter followed Mr. Green and the doctor up the stairs to the 3rd floor. This floor was different from the others. The carpet was thicker and darker. There were no windows in this part of the hallway, so the only light came from small electric lamps on the walls. They stopped in front of a very large door at the end of the hall. It was made of dark oak wood. It looked very heavy. Mr. Green hit the wood with his fist. The sound was loud and heavy, but no one answered. Mrs. Gable. Mr. Green called out. His voice was high and nervous. Mrs. Gable, it is Mr. Green. Are you okay? Everyone is waiting in the library. There was only silence. Peter leaned his head against the door. He tried to hear anything, the sound of a footstep, a cough, or even a radio. But the room was as silent as a grave. He reached down and touched the door handle. He tried to turn it, but it did not move. It was solid. Is there another way in? Peter asked. A balcony? Or a back door for the staff? Mr. Green shook his head. The balcony is too high. The walls of the manor are very straight and the rocks are dangerous below. There is no other door. This is her private suite. She likes her privacy. You are the manager. Dr. Aries said firmly. You must have a master key. Open the door now. This is a medical emergency. I have the master key. Mr. Green whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a large ring of silver keys. But look at the bottom of the door. Peter knelt down. He looked at the small space between the bottom of the door and the floor. He saw a tiny bit of metal. The key is already in the lock. Peter said. On the inside. If the key is in the lock on the other side, the master key will not work. We cannot push it out. The 3 men stood in the dark hallway. The silence of the hotel felt heavy and cold. Peter felt a strange shiver. Mrs. Gable was in there, but she was not answering. The door was locked, and the only boat was broken. They were trapped on an island with a secret that was locked behind a heavy wooden door. We have to get in. Peter said. We have to know what happened. Peter looked at the heavy door. He knew they could not break it with their hands. He looked at Mr. Green. Is the room next to this one empty? Peter asked. Mr. Green nodded. Yes. Room 301 is empty. Why do you ask? The balconies. Peter explained. The balconies on this floor are very close to each other. I can go into room 301, walk onto the balcony, and look into Mrs. Gable's window. Maybe I can see what is happening inside. Dr. Aries looked worried. It is very high. Mr. Miller. The wind is strong, and the stone is wet from the rain. It is very dangerous. I have to try. Peter said. We cannot stay here and wait. Mr. Green quickly opened the door to room 301 with his master key. Peter walked through the room to the large glass doors. He pushed them open. Immediately, a blast of cold, wet air hit his face. The sound of the ocean waves hitting the rocks far below was very loud. Peter looked over the edge of the stone railing. The drop was deep and terrifying. He looked to his left. The balcony for Mrs. Gable's suite was only 2 meters away. There was a small gap between the 2 stone platforms. Peter climbed onto the railing of his balcony. His hands were cold, and his heart was beating very fast. He looked at the grey sky and then at the dark water below. He took a deep breath. He moved slowly and carefully. He reached out and grabbed the cold metal of the next balcony. He pulled himself across the gap and landed on the other side. He was now on Mrs. Gable's balcony. He moved to the large window and put his face against the glass. He used his hands to block the light so he could see inside. The room was not empty, but it was a disaster. The beautiful room Peter expected was gone. A heavy wooden chair was lying on its side on the carpet. A lamp was broken on the floor, and the white lampshade was torn. There were many papers scattered across the room like autumn leaves. A small table near the bed was overturned. Peter looked at the large bed. The blue blankets were pulled back, but Mrs. Gable was not there. He looked at the bathroom door. It was open, but the room was dark. He looked at the corner of the room where the large wardrobe stood. The doors of the wardrobe were wide open, and some clothes were hanging out. "Mrs. Gable!" Peter called out. He hit the glass with his hand. There was no movement inside. The room was completely silent. He turned back to the hallway door and shouted to the men on the other side. "The room is a mess. Things are broken. But she is not here. Mrs. Gable is gone." He heard Dr. Aries shout something back, but the wind was too loud to understand him. Peter looked back into the messy room. He saw something on the floor near the window. It was a single purple shoe. It was the shoe Mrs. Gable wore at dinner. Peter climbed back across the gap between the two balconies. His hands were shaking from the cold and the height. He stepped into room 301 and walked back into the hallway. Mr. Green and Dr. Aries were waiting for him. Their faces were full of worry. "The room is empty," Peter said again. He tried to catch his breath. "The window was closed, but the furniture is moved. It looks like there was a struggle, and I saw one of her shoes on the floor. But the door was locked from the inside." Mr. Green cried. He looked at the heavy oak door. How can a woman leave a locked room on the third floor without using the door or the window? "We do not have time for puzzles now," Dr. Aries said. He looked very serious. "A woman is missing on a small island. We must find her. She could be hurt. She could be outside in this cold air." They went back down to the library. Marco and Victor stood up as soon as they saw the men. Peter told them what he saw through the window. The news made the group even more nervous. The mystery of the missing camera and the broken boat was now a search for a missing person. "We must divide into groups," Mr. Green said. He was trying to be a leader, but his voice was trembling. "We need to search every meter of this island." Dr. Aries looked at Victor. "Victor, you know the paths near the woods. You help Mrs. Gable with her supplies. You and I will go to the forest behind the hotel. We will check the old storage sheds and the trees." Victor nodded. He pulled his leather jacket tight. "The woods are thick and the ground is wet. It will be difficult to see anything, but we will try. Marco, Mr. Miller, and I will search the hotel grounds and the beach." Mr. Green continued. "We will look near the cliffs and the boat dock. We must be very careful. The rocks are slippery." Marco looked at the large front door. "It is going to rain again soon. We should take torches and heavy coats." The group moved quickly. They went to the small room near the entrance where the umbrellas and coats were kept. Peter took a yellow raincoat and a large metal torch. He felt the weight of the torch in his hand. It was solid and heavy. Dr. Aries and Victor went out first. Peter watched them walk toward the dark line of trees. The wind moved the branches of the trees like angry arms. The two men disappeared into the shadows of the forest. Peter turned to Mr. Green and Marco. "Let's go. We should start with the path near the cliffs." The search began in silence. The island felt much larger and more dangerous now. Every bush looked like a person, and every sound of the wind sounded like a cry for help. Peter kept his hand on the notebook in his pocket. He felt that the answer was somewhere out there, hidden in the grey mist of Blue Island. Peter walked slowly along the edge of the cliff. The wind was much stronger here than it was at the hotel. It blew his yellow raincoat against his legs and made a loud, snapping noise. Below them, the ocean waves hit the sharp grey rocks with great power. The white foam from the water jumped high into the air. The spray was cold and salty on Peter's face. Mr. Green and Marco were a few meters ahead of him. Mr. Green held a large torch, and the beam of light moved across the wet grass. Marco was shouting Mrs. Gable's name, but the wind was so loud that his voice seemed small and weak. Every time he yelled, the sound was immediately carried away by the air. "Be careful," Mr. Green shouted to the others. "The ground is very soft here because of the rain. Stay away from the edge." Peter looked down at the path. The mud was dark and messy. He saw many footprints, but it was impossible to tell who they belonged to. He shone his own torch into the thick, thorny bushes that grew along the cliff. The bushes were dark and had long, sharp branches that looked like fingers. Suddenly, Peter stopped. He saw a flash of color in the middle of a brown bush. It was not the green of a leaf or the grey of a rock. It was a bright, deep blue. He moved closer and reached into the thorns. The branches scratched the back of his hand, but he did not stop. He pulled out a small piece of cloth. The cloth was thin and very smooth. It was a piece of silk. Peter held it up to his torch. The blue color was very familiar. It was the exact same color and material as the dress Mrs. Gable wore during the strange dinner the night before. The edges of the cloth were rough and torn, as if someone had pulled it away with force. "Mr. Green. Marco. Come here," Peter called out. The two men ran back to him. Their boots made heavy, wet sounds in the mud. Peter showed them the blue silk. Mr. Green took it with trembling fingers. He looked at it for a long time. "This is from her dress," Mr. Green whispered. His face went very white. "I remember the material. She bought that dress in Paris many years ago. It was one of her favorites. She was here," Marco said. He looked at the dark cliff edge with terror in his eyes. Why was she out here in the middle of a storm? And why is the dress torn? Peter looked further down the path. The blue silk was found near a place where the path became very narrow. A few meters away, the path divided. One way went back toward the forest, and the other way went higher up the hill. Peter looked at his mental map. The higher path led directly to the old lighthouse. She didn't fall, Peter said, trying to stay calm. If she fell, the cloth would be on the rocks below, not caught in a bush on the path. She was moving fast. Maybe she was running from someone. Peter, Mr. Green, and Marco continued along the narrow path. The wind was still strong, but a light mist began to cover the ground. It made the grass look like it was floating. Peter kept his torch low. He did not want to miss any more clues. Every few steps, he stopped to look at the ground. "We are moving toward the forest now," Mr. Green said. He pointed his light at the tall, dark trees ahead. The doctor and Victor should be in there. Maybe they found something. But as they approached the place where the trees began, Peter saw something dark in the tall grass. It was not a rock or a shadow. It was a square, black object. He walked toward it and pushed the wet grass aside with his boot. It was a leather bag with 2 silver handles. "Wait," Peter said. He knelt down in the mud. "Look at this." Mr. Green leaned over. "That is the doctor's bag. Dr. Aries always carries it with him. He says a doctor is never truly off duty." The bag was lying on its side. It was wide open. Peter used his torch to see inside. The white interior of the bag was messy. Bandages were pulled out and soaked with rainwater. A small metal tool lay in the dirt. Most importantly, there were several small glass bottles. 3 of them were smashed into tiny pieces. A strong, sharp smell of medicine and alcohol rose from the bag. It was a clean, cold smell that did not belong in the wild forest. Why would he leave his bag here? Marco asked. He looked around the dark trees with wide eyes. A doctor does not just drop his tools and walk away. This bag is very important to him. Peter picked up one of the bottles that was not broken. It had no label, only a small number written in black ink. The doctor and Victor went into the woods to look for Mrs. Gable. But this bag is near the cliff path, not deep in the forest. Did they change their direction? Maybe they were attacked. Marco suggested. His voice was shaking. Maybe the person who took the camera and broke the boat is still out here. Peter looked at the broken glass. It did not look like the bag fell by accident. It looked like someone was searching for something inside it in a hurry. He stood up and looked toward the forest. He could not see any lights from the other group. There were no voices calling out. The only sound was the wind moving the heavy branches of the trees. "We need to find Dr. Aries and Victor," Peter said. If the doctor lost his bag, he might be in trouble. Or maybe he saw something that made him run. Mr. Green touched the black leather of the bag. "This island used to be so peaceful," he whispered. "Now, it feels like a trap." Peter put the unbroken bottle in his pocket. He felt a new sense of urgency. The blue silk, the missing camera, the broken boat, and now the doctor's bag. All the pieces were there, but they did not fit together yet. He began to walk faster toward the dark line of the woods. The sky above Blue Island turned from a dull gray to a deep, heavy black. The mist that once floated near the ground began to rise. It wrapped around the trees like a cold blanket. Peter looked up and felt a single, large drop of water hit his forehead. A second later, the sky seemed to open. A heavy roar of water filled the air as the rain began to fall with incredible force. This was not a light shower. It was a violent storm. The rain was so thick that Peter could hardly see Mr. Green, who was only 2 meters away. The wind pushed the water against them in waves. Peter's yellow raincoat was wet in seconds. The water ran down his face and into his eyes. He tried to wipe it away, but his hands were just as wet. "We cannot stay out here," Mr. Green shouted. He had to scream to be heard over the sound of the rain hitting the leaves. "The path will wash away. It is too dangerous." Marco was already moving back toward the hotel. He was slipping in the mud. The ground was no longer solid. It had turned into a river of dark brown water and sliding stones. Marco grabbed a tree branch to stop himself from falling down the hill. His face was full of fear. "What about the doctor?" Peter yelled back. "What about Victor and Mrs. Gable?" "We cannot help them if we are dead," Mr. Green replied. He grabbed Peter's arm. "Look at the cliff. The rocks are falling." Peter looked toward the ocean. He could not see the water anymore, but he heard a deep, rumbling sound. Large pieces of stone were breaking off the cliff and falling into the sea. The sound of the rocks hitting the water was like distant thunder. The very ground they stood on felt unstable. The 3 men began the difficult walk back to the hotel. Every step was a struggle. The wind tried to push them toward the edge of the cliff. Peter kept his head down and followed the blurry shape of Mr. Green's dark coat. His boots were heavy with mud, and his legs felt like lead. They saw the hotel in the distance. The white building looked like a ghost in the gray storm. A few lights were still burning in the windows, but they looked small and weak against the darkness of the island. It took them 30 minutes to walk a distance that usually took 10. Finally, they reached the large wooden front door. Mr. Green pushed it open with all his strength. They tumbled into the lobby, and the manager quickly slammed the door shut. The sudden silence was strange. Inside, the air was still and dry, but the three men were dripping water onto the polished floor. Peter leaned against the wall, breathing hard. He was safe for now, but he was more worried than ever. The doctor and the pilot were still out there in the dark. And somewhere, in the middle of this terrible storm, Mrs. Gable was alone. The lobby of the hotel was very quiet now. The only sound was the heavy rain hitting the roof outside. Peter, Mr. Green, and Marco stood in a circle near the reception desk. Large puddles of water grew on the floor around their feet. Mr. Green looked at the mess on his polished wood, but he did not seem to care. He looked exhausted. "I will go to the laundry room to find some dry towels and blankets," Mr. Green said. He rubbed his face with his hands. "We need to get warm. I will also check the kitchen for some hot tea." "I can do that," Marco said quickly. His voice was a bit too loud. "I am the chef. I know where everything is in the kitchen. You stay here and rest." "Mr. Green, you look like you are going to faint." Mr. Green nodded slowly. He sat down in a large chair and closed his eyes. Marco did not wait. He turned and walked toward the back of the hotel where the large kitchen was located. He moved with a strange energy, as if he was suddenly in a great hurry. Peter watched him go. He remembered the missing camera and how angry Marco was earlier. He also remembered that Marco seemed very nervous during dinner. Peter waited for a minute. Then, he moved away from the wall. He did not say anything to Mr. Green. He walked quietly after the chef. The kitchen was a large room with long metal tables and many cupboards. The air smelled of onions and old bread. Peter stayed in the shadows of the hallway and looked through the open door. Marco was not making tea. He was standing near a large shelf full of glass jars. The jars were filled with sugar, salt, and different types of flour. Marco looked over his shoulder at the door. Peter pulled his head back quickly so he would not be seen. He waited a few seconds and then looked again. Marco reached into the inner pocket of his wet jacket. He pulled out a small, black notebook. The cover was wet, but the notebook looked solid. Marco did not open it. He looked around the room one more time. Then, he opened a very large jar of white flour. He pushed the black notebook deep into the flour until it was completely covered. He closed the jar and put it back on the shelf. Peter felt a pulse of excitement. Why was the chef hiding a notebook in a flour jar? Was it his diary? Or was it something he took from Mrs. Gable's room? Peter remembered that Marco's camera was missing. Maybe the notebook had information about the camera, or perhaps it held the secret from 20 years ago. Marco began to fill a metal pot with water. Peter knew he had to leave before the chef caught him. He walked back to the lobby as fast as he could. He reached the reception desk just as Mr. Green opened his eyes. "Is the tea coming?" Mr. Green asked. "Yes," Peter said. He tried to keep his voice calm. "Marco is working on it now." Peter sat down across from the manager. His mind was racing. The list of suspects was growing. Every person on this island had something to hide. He looked at his own wet hands and then at the dark hallway. He needed to get that notebook, but he had to wait for the right moment. The large front door of the hotel opened with a heavy sound. Cold air rushed into the lobby again. Peter and Mr. Green jumped up from their chairs. Victor, the pilot, walked inside. He was alone. His leather jacket was dark with water, and he was shaking. He did not have his torch anymore. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost. "Victor!" Mr. Green cried. "Where is the doctor? Where is Dr. Aries?" Victor sat down on the floor near the door. He leaned his head against the wood. "I don't know," He whispered. His voice was very dry. The rain was too thick. 1 minute he was behind me, and the next minute he was gone. I called his name for a long time. I looked for his light, but there was nothing. Only the wind. Marco came out of the kitchen with a tray of hot tea. He stopped when he saw Victor. "The doctor is missing too?" he asked. The tray shook in his hands. The cups made a small clicking noise against the metal. "We must go back out," Mr. Green said. He reached for his wet coat. "No," Victor said. He looked up at the manager. "You cannot go out there. The path near the woods is gone. It is just mud now. If you go out, you will fall into the sea. We have to wait for the light." Mr. Green sat back down, defeated. He looked at the floor. Marco gave everyone a cup of tea. The tea was hot and smelled of lemons. Peter took a cup and sat next to Victor. He waited for the pilot to stop shaking. After a few minutes, Victor drank some tea and his face gained some color. "Victor," Peter said quietly, "you said earlier that you knew Mrs. Gable 20 years ago. You said you were not friends. What happened?" Victor looked at Peter. He looked at Mr. Green and Marco. They were all listening. Victor sighed and put his cup on the floor. 20 years ago, I was a young pilot." Victor began. "I had a small plane. I moved cargo for wealthy people. Mrs. Gable and her husband hired me for a special job. They wanted me to fly them to a private location in the middle of the night. Dr. Aries was there too. He was their family doctor even then." "Was Marco there?" Peter asked. Victor looked at the chef. Marco turned away and started cleaning a table that was already clean. Marco was the cook on their private boat. Victor continued. "We were all part of a plan. They had something very valuable. They wanted to hide it from the government. But something went wrong during the flight. There was a problem with the engine. I had to land the plane in a dangerous place. Mrs. Gable's husband, he didn't make it. He died in the accident." The room was silent. The only sound was the rain hitting the windows. "Mrs. Gable blamed me," Victor said. His voice was full of sadness. "She said it was my fault because I didn't check the plane. But Dr. Aries and Marco, they knew the truth. It wasn't an accident. Someone had damaged the plane before we left. We all stayed silent for 20 years because we were afraid. Now, she has brought us all here to face the truth." Peter wrote quickly in his notebook. The mystery was finally opening up. The secret was not just a debt. It was a death. And the suspects were all in this room. Peter went back to his room on the second floor. He felt very tired, but his mind was too busy to sleep. He took off his wet clothes and put on a dry sweater. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the notebook on his desk. Victor's story changed everything. The guests were not just friends of Mrs. Gable. They were people who shared a dark past. They were people with reasons to be afraid. He thought about the plane crash 20 years ago. If someone damaged the plane on purpose, then there was a murderer among them. Was it the doctor? Was it Marco? Or was it Mrs. Gable herself? Peter felt like he was walking in a circle. Every answer only created more questions. The rain was not as heavy now. The slow, steady rhythm of the water on the roof was the only sound. Peter walked to the window. He wanted to see if there were any lights in the woods. Maybe Dr. Aries had a torch. Maybe the doctor was trying to find his way back to the hotel. The sky was still very dark, but the moon appeared for a short moment between the clouds. Its pale light turned the island into a world of silver and grey. Peter looked at the line of trees where the forest began. The branches moved slowly in the wind. At first, everything looked normal. Then, Peter saw something that made him freeze. Near a large oak tree, there was a person. The person was not moving. They were standing perfectly still, looking up at the hotel. The person wore a long, dark coat that reached their knees. The hood of the coat was up, so Peter could not see a face. The figure looked like a dark shadow against the grey trees. Peter held his breath. Was it Dr. Aries? The doctor was wearing a grey suit earlier, not a long coat. Was it Mrs. Gable? Or was it someone else? The island was supposed to be private. Mr. Green said there were no other houses and no other people. The person in the woods did not move for several minutes. They just stood there, watching the windows of the hotel. Peter felt a cold shiver go down his back. He felt like the person was looking directly at him, even though his room was dark. Suddenly, the moon disappeared behind a thick cloud. The light went away, and the woods became black again. Peter waited for the light to return. When the moon came out again a minute later, the space near the oak tree was empty. The person was gone. Peter ran to his door and opened it. He wanted to tell Mr. Green, but he stopped. Who could he trust? Mr. Green was hiding notes. Marco was hiding a notebook in a flower jar. Victor was a pilot with a tragic past. And the doctor was missing. Peter closed his door and locked it. He went to his bed and pulled the map out from under his pillow. He looked at the line that led to the lighthouse. The truth is there, the map said. Peter knew he could not wait for the morning. He had to find out who was in the woods and what was happening at the lighthouse. Peter put on his heavy boots and grabbed his yellow raincoat. He checked his metal torch. The light was still strong. He knew he was taking a big risk by going out again, but he could not sit in his room. He needed to find out who was standing in the woods. He needed to know if that person was a friend or an enemy. He walked to the door of his room and listened carefully. The hallway was silent. He did not want to see Mr. Green or Marco in the lobby. He remembered a small service staircase at the end of the hall. He walked to it quietly. The stairs were narrow and made of cold metal. He went down slowly, step by step, trying not to make a sound. He found a small wooden door at the bottom of the stairs. It was not locked. He pushed it open and stepped outside. The heavy rain had stopped, but a thick mist covered everything. The air was very cold. He was now in the hotel garden. The garden was a mess. The wind had broken many flowers, and the ground was covered in wet leaves and mud. Peter took the map out of his pocket. He used his torch to look at the drawing. The wavy line on the map started behind a large stone statue of a bird. He looked around the garden and saw the statue near the edge of the forest. It was a tall, grey owl made of stone. He walked to the statue. Behind it, there was a thick wall of green bushes. At first, it looked like there was no way through, but when Peter pushed the wet branches aside, he saw a narrow opening. It was a hidden path. It was not a path for guests. It was old and overgrown with weeds. Peter entered the path. The ground was very soft, and his boots made a deep, wet sound in the mud. The trees on both sides were very close together. Their branches touched each other above the path, creating a dark tunnel of wood and leaves. Peter felt like the forest was closing in on him. He kept his torch low. He did not want a bright light to show his position. He moved slowly and carefully. After walking for a few minutes, he stopped. He looked at the ground. There was a fresh footprint in the mud. It was much larger than his own foot. The water from the mist was still filling the shape of the boot. Someone had walked this way only a few minutes ago. Peter felt his heart beat faster. Was it the person he saw from his window? He looked ahead into the dark tunnel of trees. The path began to go up the hill. According to the map, this path led directly to the old lighthouse. Peter took a deep breath and continued to walk. He was moving away from the safety of the hotel and into the heart of the mystery. Peter climbed higher. The path was very steep now. He had to use his hands to grab onto cold rocks and wet tree roots. The air became even colder, and the wind began to blow harder. He could hear the ocean again. The sound of the waves hitting the cliff was like a deep, heavy drum. The salty smell of the sea was everywhere. Finally, the trees became thinner. Peter stepped out onto a large, flat area of grass at the top of the cliff. In front of him stood the old lighthouse. It was a very tall, round tower. In the past, it was probably a bright white, but now the paint was grey and falling off in large pieces. The glass at the top was dark and broken. It looked like a giant stone finger pointing at the sky. Peter stood still for a moment. He looked back at the hotel. From here, the hotel looked small and far away. He was completely alone on the edge of the island. He turned his torch toward the base of the lighthouse. He saw a heavy metal door. The door was covered in dark brown rust. It looked like it had not been opened for many years. He walked toward the door. The grass here was tall and moved in the wind like waves. He reached the door and saw something interesting. There were fresh scratches on the metal near the handle. The rust was scraped away, and the silver metal underneath was shining in the light of his torch. Someone had used a heavy tool to force the door open very recently. Peter reached out and touched the handle. It was freezing cold. He pushed the door, but it did not move. He pushed again with all his strength. The door began to move very slowly. It made a long, high-pitched scraping noise as it moved against the stone floor. Peter stopped and waited. He looked around to see if anyone heard the noise, but there was only the sound of the wind and the sea. He pushed one more time, and the door opened just enough for him to walk inside. He felt a rush of air from the inside of the tower. It smelled like old dust and wet stone. It was a very old, heavy smell. He stepped into the darkness and turned his torch around the room. The inside of the lighthouse was a large, empty circle. In the center, there was a metal staircase that went up into the darkness. Peter's torch showed many spiderwebs hanging from the ceiling like thin curtains. He saw a small wooden table near the stairs. On the table, there were several old candles and a box of matches. Peter felt a strange feeling in his stomach. He was inside the place from the map. He was close to the truth. He took a step forward, and his boot made a loud sound on the stone. He stopped and listened. Was there someone else in the tower? He looked up at the spiral stairs. The mystery was waiting for him at the top. Peter took another step into the base of the lighthouse. The air was thick with the smell of salt and very old dust. It was hard to breathe. He kept his torch moving in slow circles. The metal staircase in the center of the room looked like a giant skeleton. It went up and up until the light of his torch could not reach the top. He walked toward the small wooden table he saw earlier. He stopped suddenly and turned off his torch. The room was not completely dark. There was a small, flickering yellow light on the table. It was a small oil lamp. The flame was tiny, but it was burning. Peter felt a cold wave of fear. A burning lamp meant a person was here. And because the lamp was still full of oil, that person had to be very close. He looked at the glass of the lamp. It was warm. He then looked at the rest of the table. There was a glass of water next to the lamp. He touched the glass. It was not cold like the air in the tower. Someone had brought it here recently. "Is anyone here?" Peter asked. His voice sounded small in the large, round room. The stone walls carried his voice up the stairs, and it came back to him like a ghost. There was no answer. He turned his torch back on and looked at the floor near the table. He saw fresh mud. There were 2 sets of footprints. One set was large, like the boots he saw on the path. The other set was smaller and more delicate. They looked like the shoes of a woman. "Mrs. Gable." Peter whispered. He looked up at the spiral stairs. The metal steps were rusty and thin. He put his hand on the railing and felt it shake. Somewhere high above him, he heard a soft, scraping sound. It was the sound of a shoe moving against stone. It was very quiet, but in the silence of the tower, it was easy to hear. Peter began to climb. He moved as quietly as he could. He placed his feet on the edges of the steps because the metal was stronger there. The stairs made a low, ringing sound every time he moved. Each step felt like a huge effort. He was tired, but the mystery pushed him forward. He reached the first small platform. There was a narrow window in the wall. He looked out and saw the dark ocean. The white foam of the waves looked like teeth in the dark. He was already high above the ground. He looked up again. The shadow of the staircase moved on the walls as his torch swayed. He heard the scraping sound again. This time, it was followed by a heavy sigh. It was the sound of someone who was very tired or very sad. Peter stopped. He was only one floor away from the person. He turned off his torch again. He did not want the light to show his position. He waited in the dark, listening to his own heart. The truth was just a few steps away. Peter climbed the last few steps. He was now in a small, round room just below the large glass lantern of the tower. The walls were made of cold, grey stone, and the floor was covered in old, dried sea salt. There were several wooden boxes in the corner, covered in thick spiderwebs. In the middle of the room, there was a small wooden desk with a single drawer. The desk looked very old, but the dust on top of it was disturbed. Peter turned his torch on again. The bright beam of light moved across the desk. He saw a white envelope sitting on the dark wood. It looked clean and new, which was very strange in this dusty place. Peter walked to the desk and picked up the envelope. His fingers were shaking slightly. He saw a name written on the front in elegant, blue ink. Eleanor Gable. He looked around the room. The person who sighed was not there. Perhaps they had moved higher, to the very top of the tower where the big light was located. But Peter was too curious about the envelope. He opened it slowly. The paper inside was thick and yellow. It looked like it was many years old, even if the envelope was new. Peter began to read the letter. The handwriting was sharp and narrow. "Dear Eleanor," the letter began. "I know you are trying to forget the past. I know you want to pretend that the night 20 years ago never happened. But the ocean does not forget. We still have a hidden debt. The others want their share of the gold, and they are tired of waiting. If you do not pay, the truth about the flight will be told to everyone. We will meet at the lighthouse when the moon is high." There was no signature at the bottom. Peter read the words again. A hidden debt. Their share of the gold. This was the secret Mrs. Gable wanted to tell in the library. She was being threatened. Someone was angry about the plane crash from 20 years ago. Peter thought about the guests at the hotel. Dr. Aries, Marco, and Victor were all on that flight. Victor said the crash was a tragedy. But this letter mentioned gold. Was there a treasure on that plane? And who wrote this note? Was it one of the guests? Or was there someone else on the island? Suddenly, Peter felt a cold wind on the back of his neck. He turned around quickly, shining his torch toward the stairs. He saw a shadow move on the stone wall. It was the shadow of a tall person. They were standing on the level above him, looking down through a small hole in the ceiling. "Who is there?" Peter called out. His voice was loud and clear in the small room. There was no answer. Instead, he heard the sound of heavy boots moving quickly up the final metal ladder to the glass room at the very top. Peter put the letter into his pocket and ran toward the ladder. He had to know who was hiding in the lighthouse. Peter grabbed the metal ladder with both hands. The metal was cold and felt slippery. He climbed quickly. He wanted to reach the top before the person disappeared. He pushed his head through the small opening in the ceiling and entered the glass room at the very top of the lighthouse. This was the lantern room. In the past, a giant light lived here to guide ships. Now, the room was empty and cold. The large glass windows were thick with salt and dirt. The moon was behind the clouds again, so the room was very dark. Peter turned on his torch. The light of his torch hit a man standing by the window. Peter stopped. He expected to see a stranger or perhaps the missing doctor, but the man in the lighthouse was Mr. Green. The hotel manager was wearing a long, dark coat. His hair was messy from the wind, and his face was full of anger. He held a heavy metal tool in his hand. He looked very different from the polite man at the reception desk. "What are you doing here, Mr. Miller?" Mr. Green asked. His voice was loud and sharp. He did not sound like a manager anymore. "I found a path," Peter said. He tried to keep his voice steady. "I saw a light in the tower. I thought Mrs. Gable might be here. Or the doctor." Mr. Green took a step toward him. "You should not be here. I told everyone to stay at the hotel. It is dangerous to walk on the cliffs at night. The ground is soft. You could fall and die." "I saw someone in the woods, Mr. Green," Peter said. "I followed them. I think someone is hiding on this island." Mr. Green looked at Peter's pocket. He saw the corner of the white envelope. His eyes became narrow. "What is that in your pocket? Did you take something from this room?" "It is just my notebook." Peter lied. He did not want to show the letter yet. He did not know if Mr. Green was the person who wrote it. "Why are you here, Mr. Green? You said you were going to the kitchen for tea." "I am the manager of this island," Mr. Green replied. He moved closer. "I have to check all the buildings. I have to make sure the property is safe. But you are a guest. You are a journalist. Your job is to ask questions, not to break into private buildings." The wind hit the glass windows with great force. It made a low, mourning sound. Mr. Green pointed toward the ladder. "Go back to the hotel, Mr. Miller. Now. I will follow you. If I see you outside your room again tonight, I will lock you in the cellar for your own safety. Do you understand?" Peter looked at the heavy tool in Mr. Green's hand. He realized he could not fight the man here. The lighthouse was too high and the stairs were too narrow. He nodded slowly. He moved back to the ladder and began to climb down. He felt Mr. Green's eyes on his back the whole time. He had the letter, but now he had a new enemy. The walk back to the hotel was a nightmare of silence. Mr. Green walked 2 meters behind Peter, his heavy boots rhythmically hitting the wet ground. Every time Peter glanced back, the manager's torch beam would hit him directly in the eyes, a silent warning to keep moving. The mist had thickened, turning the hotel into a blurred mountain of dark grey stone. They entered through the same small service door Peter had used to sneak out. Once inside the warm, dry hallway, Mr. Green finally spoke. "Go to your room, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice as cold as the sea spray. "I will be watching the hallways tonight, for everyone's safety." Peter didn't argue. He climbed the stairs, went into room 202, and locked the door. He listened until he heard Mr. Green's footsteps fade away toward the lobby. He sat on his bed and pulled out the letter again. A hidden debt, their share of the gold. The words burned in his mind. If there was gold on that plane 20 years ago, then this wasn't just a story about a crash, it was a story about a heist. But Peter remembered something else. Marco, the chef, had hidden a notebook in the kitchen earlier. If Mr. Green was busy guarding the front of the house, perhaps the back was open. Peter waited for 20 minutes, his heart hammering against his ribs. He then moved to his door, turned the key with agonizing slowness, and slipped out. He didn't use the stairs. He remembered a small service lift, a dumbwaiter, used for moving luggage and laundry. It was small, but Peter was thin. He squeezed into the wooden box and pulled the ropes, lowering himself down to the kitchen level. The gears groaned, but the sound of the wind outside masked the noise. He stepped out into the dark kitchen. The smell of cold grease and flour was strong. He didn't use his torch. Instead, he used the faint light of the moon coming through the high windows. He found the shelf of jars. His hands searched the cold glass until he found the largest one. He unscrewed the lid. The smell of dry flour filled his nose. He reached his hand deep into the white powder. His fingers hit something hard and rectangular. He pulled it out. It was the black notebook Marco had hidden. Peter moved to a corner where the shadows were deepest and clicked on his torch for just a second. He flipped through the pages. It wasn't a diary. It was a logbook. There were years of these entries. The amounts were large, and the names were always the same. Dr. A. and the pilot. At the very back of the book, there was a single note scribbled in red ink. She knows we took the bars. She has the manifest. If she talks to the journalist, we are all finished. Peter's blood went cold. The bars must be the gold. The guests weren't just victims of a crash. They were thieves who had been paying someone, or being paid, to keep quiet. And now, they thought Peter was the threat. Suddenly, the kitchen door creaked open. A thin line of light moved across the floor. Peter froze. He didn't have time to get back to the dumbwaiter. He scrambled backward, his boots sliding silently on the linoleum floor, and shoved himself into the narrow space beneath a heavy stainless steel prep table. A long, white tablecloth hung down, hiding him from view. The door swung open fully. The footsteps were heavy and rhythmic. Thud, drag, thud. It wasn't the quick, nervous step of Marco, nor the stiff, formal walk of Mr. Green. Through a small gap in the cloth, Peter saw a pair of boots. They were covered in thick, drying mud and bits of seaweed. The person stopped right in front of the shelf with the flour jars. Peter held his breath, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure the stranger could hear it. A hand reached up. It wasn't Marco's hand. This hand was pale, with long, thin fingers and a heavy gold ring on the pinky finger. Peter recognized it instantly. It was the family crest of the Gables, a small, silver owl. Dr. Aries wore a ring like that. But so did Victor. The person unscrewed the jar. Peter heard the lid clatter onto the shelf. There was a long silence. Then, a low, guttural growl of frustration. The jar was slammed back onto the shelf with such force that the glass cracked. "Where is it?" A voice whispered. It was Dr. Aries. The doctor's voice was usually calm and cold, but now it was jagged with panic. He began throwing other jars off the shelf. Glass shattered across the floor. Flour erupted into the air like a white cloud. Peter pulled his face away as a fine dust of flour settled over his shoes. "I know you have it. Marco." Aries hissed to the empty room. "You greedy fool. You're going to get us all killed." The doctor turned and headed for the back door, the one leading toward the cellar and the generator room. He didn't check under the tables. He was too consumed by his own rage. As soon as the door clicked shut, Peter crawled out from his hiding spot. He was covered in white flour, looking like a ghost. He looked at the notebook in his hand. He now had proof that the doctor was looking for it. But more importantly, Dr. Aries wasn't missing. He had been hiding somewhere, waiting for the right moment to reclaim the evidence of their crime. Peter knew he couldn't go back to his room yet. If Aries was heading to the cellar, that was where the answers, and perhaps Mrs. Gable, were hidden. He followed the trail of white footprints the doctor had left in the flour. The air in the cellar was thick and smelled of wet earth and ancient iron. Peter followed the white flower footprints down a set of narrow stone stairs that felt like they were leading into the very heart of the island. The temperature dropped significantly. He could see his own breath puffing out in small, ghostly clouds. At the bottom of the stairs, the trail of flour grew faint, but the sound of voices guided him. He pressed his back against the cold, damp wall and peered around a corner. A heavy iron door at the end of the corridor was slightly ajar, casting a thin, flickering yellow light onto the floor. "I told you to stay in the woods until I signaled." Dr. Ares's voice hissed from inside the room. "The storm was too much, Ares." A tired voice replied. "It was Victor. The cliff path is washing away. If I stayed out there, I'd be at the bottom of the sea by now. Besides, did you find the book?" "No." Ares spat. "Someone took it from the jar. Probably that chef, Marco. He always was a greedy rat. If that book gets out, the accident 20 years ago becomes a triple murder. We won't just lose the gold, we'll lose our lives." Peter's heart stopped. Triple murder. He thought only Mr. Gable had died in the crash. Who else was on that plane? He moved inches closer, his eyes fixed on the gap in the door. Inside, the room was filled with old boiler pipes and wooden crates. On a central table sat a heavy, rectangular object wrapped in a tattered piece of oilcloth. Dr. Ares reached out and pulled the cloth back. The light from a small lantern hit the object, and for a second, Peter was blinded by the reflection. It was a bar, dull, heavy, and unmistakably gold. "We only have 3 bars left," Victor said, his voice trembling. "Mrs. Gable spent the rest keeping the hotel running and paying us to stay quiet. She's gone crazy, Ares. Bringing that journalist here. She wants to confess. She wants to clear her soul before she dies. She won't confess anything if she can't speak." Ares said darkly. "Where is she?" Victor asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Ares pointed to a smaller door at the back of the boiler room, one secured with a heavy padlock. "She's resting. She'll stay there until the supply boat comes. We'll tell the authorities she wandered off in the storm. A tragic accident. Just like her husband." Peter felt a surge of adrenaline. Mrs. Gable was alive, but she was a prisoner in her own hotel. He looked at the black notebook in his hand. This was the evidence she needed. But he was one man against a doctor with a cold heart and a pilot who had nothing left to lose. Suddenly, a heavy hand landed on Peter's shoulder. He tried to scream, but a large, rough palm was slammed over his mouth. He was pulled back into the shadows of the corridor. "Don't make a sound." A voice whispered in his ear. It was Marco. The chef was pale, his eyes wide with terror, but he wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding the missing camera. Marco dragged Peter back through the dark corridor, away from the light of the boiler room. Only when they were safely behind a stack of dusty wine crates did the chef release his grip. Both men were breathing hard, their lungs burning in the damp, heavy air. "You followed me," Marco whispered, his eyes darting toward the stone stairs. "I saw you in the kitchen, Peter. I knew you saw the jar. You hid that notebook to protect yourself," Peter said, clutching the black book to his chest. "And you didn't lose your camera. You've been using it, haven't you?" Marco nodded slowly. He held up the heavy professional camera. "I'm a chef, but I'm also a man who likes to have a backup plan. 20 years ago, I saw what they did on that plane. I saw Ares take a heavy wrench to the engine. I saw the gold bars. I was just the cook. I did what I was told because I was afraid of the water. But I've been recording everything since we arrived on this island." What triple murder was Ares talking about? Peter asked, his voice low. Victor said only Mr. Gable died. Marco's face twisted in pain. There were 2 young guards on that flight. Private security for the gold. They didn't die in the crash, Peter. They survived the landing on the beach. But Ares said we couldn't have witnesses. He and Victor. They made sure the guards didn't leave the island. They buried them near the old lighthouse. That's why the map says the truth is there. Peter felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't just a heist. It was a cold-blooded execution. And Mrs. Gable. Was she part of it? She was unconscious from the crash. Marco whispered. By the time she woke up, the guards were gone and the gold was hidden. She suspected, but she chose to believe the accident story for years. But the guilt ate her alive. She's been paying Ares and Victor for 2 decades to keep them from killing her too. This dinner, this story she wanted you to write, it was her way of calling for help without saying the words. Suddenly, a loud metallic echo came from the boiler room. The heavy iron door groaned on its hinges. They're moving the gold. Marco hissed. They want to get it to the lighthouse. There's a sea cave beneath the tower. If the storm clears, Victor thinks he can get a small raft out to a passing ship he signaled earlier. We have to get the key to Mrs. Gable's cell, Peter said, looking at the heavy padlock through the gap in the crates. If we can get her out, we can make it to the roof. The hotel has an old emergency flare kit in the manager's office. Ares has the key in his pocket, Marco said. And he has a scalpel. He's faster than he looks. Before Peter could respond, the sound of footsteps approached. A beam of light cut through the corridor, sweeping over the wine crates. Peter and Marco pressed themselves into the shadows, making themselves as small as possible. I heard a whisper. Victor's voice called out, sounding ragged and close. Ares, I tell you, someone is down here. The journalist isn't in his room. I checked the service lift. It was moved. The light stopped directly on the crate hiding Peter's shoulder. Peter looked at Marco. The chef gripped his camera like a weapon. Peter gripped the notebook. The time for hiding was over. The truth was out, and now they had to fight for their lives. The beam of Victor's torch locked onto the edge of the wine crate. I see you. He growled. The footsteps accelerated, the sound of heavy boots splashing through shallow puddles on the stone floor. Peter stood up, pulling the black notebook from his pocket and holding it high. It's over, Victor. We know about the guards. We know about the gold in the sea cave. It's all in here, every payment, every date, and every name. Victor stopped. His face, illuminated from below by his own light, looked like a skull. Behind him, Dr. Ares stepped into the hallway. The doctor was no longer the polished man in the grey suit. He was covered in dust, his glasses lopsided, and he held a long, silver scalpel that glinted dangerously. Give me the book, Mr. Miller. Ares said, his voice eerily calm. You are a long way from the mainland. No one knows you are here. No one will find you if you disappear into the tide. Marco has the photos. Peter countered, stepping out from behind the crates. He's been recording you since you arrived. Digital backups, Ares. You can't kill a signal once it's sent. It was a lie. There was no signal in this storm. But it made Ares hesitate. The doctor's eyes darted to Marco, who was still crouching in the shadows. The cook. Ares laughed, a dry, rattling sound. The cook doesn't have the courage to press the shutter. Try me, Marco said. In that instant, Marco stood up and raised the professional camera to his eye. Before Ares could move, the cellar was filled with a blinding, white explosion of light. The high-powered flash of the camera bounced off the whitewashed stone walls, turning the dark corridor into a world of pure, stinging brightness. Ares and Victor cried out, dropping their torches and covering their eyes. The sudden transition from darkness to intense light left them momentarily blind. Their retinas burned with blue and purple spots. Now! Marco yelled. Peter didn't head for the stairs. He ran straight at Dr. Aries. As the doctor stumbled, Peter reached for the pocket of the doctor's heavy coat. His fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. The ring of keys. He yanked them out just as Aries swung the scalpel blindly through the air, the blade catching the sleeve of Peter's yellow raincoat and tearing the plastic. "I've got them!" Peter shouted. He and Marco scrambled past the blinded men, dashing into the boiler room. Peter slammed the heavy iron door shut and slid the bolt home. He heard Victor and Aries throwing themselves against the metal on the other side, screaming in rage. Peter ran to the small door at the back. He tried 3 different keys before the 4th one slid into the padlock. With a heavy click, the lock fell open. Inside the small, windowless room, Eleanor Gable sat on a wooden cot. She looked small and frail, her purple dress torn and stained with soot. But when she looked up at Peter, her eyes weren't full of fear. They were full of a terrible, cold relief. "You found it," she whispered, looking at the notebook in his hand. "The weight, it's finally going to drop." "We have to go, Mrs. Gable," Peter said, helping her to her feet. "The door won't hold them forever. We have to get to the roof." The iron door of the boiler room shuddered under a heavy blow. A deep, echoing boom vibrated through the stone floor, followed by the screech of metal straining against the bolt. Aries and Victor were using a heavy pipe or a sledgehammer. They didn't have much time. "This way," Mrs. Gable said. Her voice was thin, but it carried a strange authority. She pointed toward a narrow wooden door hidden behind a stack of coal sacks. "It is the old ash lift. It leads directly to the pantry behind the kitchen. It is small, but it will take us up." Marco and Peter quickly cleared the sacks. Behind them, the iron door groaned again. A small crack appeared in the frame. Peter shoved the wooden door open, revealing a cramped, vertical shaft with a hand-pulled pulley system. "Marco, help her in," Peter commanded. The large chef gently lifted Mrs. Gable into the small wooden box of the lift. It was a tight fit. Marco squeezed in next to her, leaving barely any room. "What about you?" Marco asked, his eyes wide. "I'll take the service stairs," Peter said, clutching the notebook. "Pull the rope as fast as you can. I'll meet you in the manager's office on the 1st floor. The flare kit is in the cabinet behind the desk." Peter slammed the lift door shut just as the iron door to the boiler room gave way with a deafening crash. He didn't look back. He bolted for the service stairs, his boots thundering on the metal steps. He could hear Aries screaming his name from below, a sound of pure, unfiltered malice. He reached the ground floor, his lungs screaming for air. He burst through the pantry door and into the kitchen. The room was a wreck of white flour and shattered glass from Aries's earlier rampage. He saw the doors of the ash lift slide open, and Marco helped Mrs. Gable out. They were covered in grey dust but unhurt. "To the office," Peter hissed. They ran through the darkened dining room, their shadows dancing wildly on the walls. They reached the lobby, but Peter skidded to a halt. The front door of the hotel was standing wide open. The cold wind was howling through the entrance, bringing with it the salt-heavy mist. Standing by the reception desk was Mr. Green. He wasn't looking for them. He was staring out into the storm, holding a heavy iron key, the key to the lighthouse. "Mr. Green," Peter shouted. "We need the flares. Aries and Victor." Mr. Green turned slowly. His expression was unreadable. "The flares are gone, Mr. Miller," he said quietly. "I took them to the roof 20 minutes ago. But the wind is too strong. They won't light. We have to try." Peter insisted. "We have the evidence. The police will come if they see the signal." "The police won't come to Blue Island tonight," a voice echoed from the stairs. Peter turned. Dr. Aries stood on the first landing, his clothes torn, his face smeared with flour and soot. He looked like a nightmare. In his hand, he no longer held a scalpel. He held a small, black pistol. "The gold is already moving," Aries said, pointing the gun at Peter's chest. "And you, Mr. Miller, are going to help us carry the rest of it." The air in the lobby was freezing, smelling of wet earth and the copper tang of old metal. Dr. Aries stood on the stairs, the small black pistol looking heavy and wrong in his surgical hand. His eyes moved between the notebook in Peter's grip and the pale face of Mrs. Gable. "Give me the book, Peter," Aries repeated. "And Marco, put that camera on the floor. Now." Marco slowly lowered the camera. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were fixed on Aries with a look of deep disgust. Mrs. Gable stepped forward, moving away from Peter's side. She looked up at her doctor, her expression filled with a strange, tired pity. "It won't work, Aries," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. "The boat engine is destroyed, the radio is smashed, and the storm is growing. Even if you kill us all and take the gold, where will you go? You are trapped on this rock with the ghosts of the men you killed. Victor has a plan," Aries snapped. "There is a freighter waiting 5 miles out. We have the coordinates. We just need the rest of the bars and a way to signal them. We don't need you anymore, Eleanor." Mr. Green, who had been standing silently by the desk, suddenly moved. He didn't run away. Instead, he reached into the drawer of the reception desk and pulled out a heavy brass key. "You're wrong about the flares, Doctor," Mr. Green said. His voice was no longer thin and nervous. It was deep and commanding. "I didn't take them to the roof. I hid them. And I'm the only one who knows the code to the emergency locker." Aries turned the gun toward Mr. Green. "Open it. Now." "No," Mr. Green said. He held the key over the open gap of the service elevator shaft. "If you shoot, I drop the key. It falls into the darkness of the cellar, and you stay on this island until the supply boat arrives with the police. They'll find the guards' bodies at the lighthouse. They'll find the gold. And they'll find you." The silence in the lobby was absolute. The only sound was the wind screaming through the open front door. Peter realized that Mr. Green hadn't been a passive manager. He was the keeper of the island's last line of defense. Aries looked at the elevator shaft, then at Mr. Green. His finger tightened on the trigger. Peter knew he had to do something. He looked at the heavy marble bust of a poet sitting on a pedestal near the stairs. It was only a few inches from his hand. "Wait!" Peter shouted, drawing Aries's attention back to him. "There's something you didn't read in the notebook, Aries. The last page. Marco didn't just write down the payments. He wrote down the name of the man who sold you out 20 years ago. The man who told the government about the gold before the plane even took off." Aries's eyes widened. "What? Who?" "It wasn't Marco. And it wasn't the pilot." Peter lied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was the person who took the biggest share. The person who stayed in the shadows while you did the dirty work." Aries's gaze flickered toward the front door, looking for Victor. In that split second of doubt, Peter grabbed the marble bust and threw it with all his strength toward the stairs. The marble bust hit the wooden banister with a bone-jarring crack. White stone exploded into 100 sharp splinters. Dr. Aries instinctively ducked, his hands flying up to protect his face from the flying shards. The small black pistol slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly down the stairs before sliding across the polished floor toward the open elevator shaft. "The gun!" Marco yelled. Aries lunged for it, but the weapon hit the edge of the shaft and vanished into the darkness with a distant, metallic noise. Aries stayed on his knees, his face red with fury, looking down into the black hole where his power had just disappeared. "Run!" Mr. Green commanded. He grabbed Mrs. Gable's arm and pulled her toward the grand staircase, bypassing Aries. Peter and Marco followed close behind. They took the stairs 2 at a time, their lungs burning as they climbed past the 2nd floor, then the 3rd. They could hear Aries recovering below, his screams of rage echoing up the central stairwell. "Victor is at the side door," Mr. Green shouted over his shoulder. "He's coming up the service ladder. We have to reach the roof before they cut us off." They reached the top floor, a narrow, dusty hallway used only for storage. At the very end was a small metal ladder leading to a heavy trapdoor. Mr. Green scrambled up first, throwing his shoulder against the wood. With a groan of rusted hinges, the door swung open, and a blast of freezing rain and wind roared into the hallway. One by one, they climbed out onto the flat, stone roof of the Gable Manor. The scene was terrifying. The sky was a swirling vortex of black and charcoal grey. The ocean below was a wall of white foam, and the old lighthouse on the cliff stood like a jagged tooth against the lightning. "The locker!" Peter shouted, shielding his eyes from the rain. Mr. Green led them to a small, reinforced metal box bolted to the base of a chimney stack. He pulled the heavy brass key from his pocket and jammed it into the lock. The wind was so strong it nearly tore the door from his hand as it clicked open. Inside, tucked in waterproof padding, were 3 thick orange tubes. Emergency flares. "How do they work?" Marco asked, huddled against the chimney for warmth. "You twist the base and pull the cord," Mr. Green yelled. "But we only have 3. If the freighter doesn't see them through the mist, we're finished." "Wait," Peter said, looking toward the forest. "Look." Through the sheets of rain, a light was moving. It wasn't a torch. It was a fire. At the edge of the woods, near the old storage sheds, an orange glow was growing. The wind was fanning the flames, and the dry wood of the sheds was catching fast. "They're burning the evidence," Mrs. Gable cried out, her voice breaking. "The guards, the site, they're trying to hide the bodies." "No," Peter realized, looking at the pattern of the fire. "It's a signal. Victor is setting the woods on fire to guide the freighter in. He doesn't care about the hotel anymore. He just wants the boat." Suddenly, the trapdoor behind them slammed against the roof. A hand reached out, a hand wearing a leather pilot's glove. Victor hauled himself onto the roof, his face streaked with mud and blood. In his other hand, he held a flare gun he had taken from the boat. "Give me the flares," Victor growled, stepping toward them. "Give them to me, or I'll burn this whole house down with you on top of it." Victor stood on the edge of the roof, silhouetted against the roaring darkness of the storm. The wind whipped his leather jacket, making it snap like a flag. He leveled the flare gun at Mr. Green's chest. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, the look of a man who had lost everything but his greed. "The rain is putting out the fire in the woods," Victor screamed over the gale. "The freighter won't see the smoke. I need those high-altitude flares. Give them to me, or I'll start the fire right here on these old wooden shingles." "You'll kill us all, Victor," Mrs. Gable shouted, her voice trembling but defiant. "Including yourself." "I don't care," he replied. "I'm not going to prison for what happened 20 years ago. I'd rather go to the bottom of the Atlantic." Mr. Green gripped the orange tubes tightly. He looked at Peter, a silent question in his eyes. Peter knew that if they gave Victor the flares, the freighter, likely a ship full of criminals, would arrive, and they would be eliminated as witnesses. If they didn't, Victor might pull the trigger. Suddenly, the trapdoor burst open again. Dr. Aries scrambled out, gasping for air. He was covered in white flour and soot, looking more like a demon than a doctor. He saw Victor with the gun and a jagged smile crossed his face. "Get them, Victor," Aries urged, clutching his side. The notebook is in the journalist's pocket. Get the flares, and we can leave this cursed island behind. Peter looked at the orange tubes in Mr. Green's hand. He realized the flares weren't just for signaling the freighter. They were their only hope for a rescue from the real authorities. If they could fire them in a specific pattern, maybe a Coast Guard vessel or a nearby lighthouse would see them. "Marco, now!" Peter yelled. Marco, the largest of the group, didn't hesitate. He didn't go for the gun. Instead, he grabbed a heavy, rusted metal bucket used for chimney ash and lunged at Dr. Aries, who was still weak from the climb. The two men collided, tumbling across the slick, wet stones of the roof. Victor shifted his aim toward Marco, but that was the opening Peter needed. Peter dove forward, his boots sliding on the wet surface. He didn't reach for the gun. He reached for the notebook in his own pocket and threw it toward the edge of the roof, toward the sea. "No!" Victor screamed. His instinct as a conspirator took over. He reached out to grab the evidence of his crimes before it vanished into the waves. As he leaned over the low stone railing, Mr. Green acted with the speed of a younger man. He twisted the base of the first flare and pulled the cord. The roof was suddenly bathed in an artificial, bloody red light. The flare didn't go into the sky. Because of the wind, it shot horizontally, passing inches from Victor's head. The heat and light were so intense that Victor recoiled, dropping his flare gun. The small weapon skittered across the roof and fell into the darkness below. Victor scrambled back, shielding his eyes. The red phosphorus burned brightly on the stone, hissing as the rain hit it. "The second one!" Peter shouted. "Higher! Aim for the clouds!" Mr. Green handed the second flare to Peter. Peter felt the vibration of the chemical reaction in his hands. He pointed it straight up, waited for a break in the wind, and pulled. A second red star ascended into the black sky, hanging there for a few precious seconds, a lonely beacon of truth in a sea of lies. Far out on the horizon, past the crashing waves and the mist, a tiny white light flickered. It wasn't the freighter. It was moving too fast, and it was flashing a rhythmic, blue and white signal. "A patrol boat," Mrs. Gable whispered, her eyes filling with tears. They saw it. The blue and white lights on the horizon grew larger and brighter with every passing second. They weren't just flickering. They were cutting through the storm with purpose. The sound of a powerful engine began to compete with the roar of the wind. It was the deep, rhythmic thrum of a Coast Guard cutter. Victor stared at the approaching lights, his face frozen in a mask of disbelief. "No," he whispered, the word barely audible. "The freighter was supposed to be here. They promised." "Your friends saw the flares and the patrol boat, Victor," Peter said, stepping toward him. "They aren't coming for you. In their world, a witness is a liability. And right now, you're the biggest liability on the Atlantic." Victor looked down at his empty hands, then at the dark, churning water below. For a moment, Peter feared the pilot might jump, choosing the sea over a prison cell. But the light of the second flare finally died out, and the massive searchlight of the Coast Guard vessel swept across the island. It hit the roof of Gable Manor with the force of a physical blow, pinning them all in a column of brilliant, artificial day. "Stay where you are," a voice boomed from a loudspeaker, amplified by the cliffs. Dr. Aries huddled on the stone floor, his hands over his eyes. The great doctor looked small and broken. The arrogance that had carried him through 20 years of lies had vanished. "I can explain everything," Aries stammered, his voice cracking. "It was the pilot. He forced me. I was just trying to protect Eleanor." Mrs. Gable walked toward him, her silhouette dark against the blinding searchlight. 20 years, Aries. You took my money, you took my peace, and you took the lives of those young guards. You didn't protect me. You caged me." Marco stepped forward, holding his camera high like a trophy. "I've got it all, Doctor. The conversation in the cellar, the gold bar on the table, and the look on your face when you realized the game was over. It's all recorded. Peter reached into his inner pocket and pulled out the black logbook. He smiled at Victor. The book I threw. That was just my travel diary. The real evidence never left my side. Victor slumped against the chimney, all the fight gone out of him. He knew the hidden debt had finally come due. Within 20 minutes, the roof was swarming with men in dark blue uniforms. They moved with professional speed, securing the perimeter and placing Aries and Victor in heavy metal handcuffs. Medical officers tended to Mrs. Gable, wrapping her in a thick, wool emergency blanket. As Peter watched the officers lead the two men toward the stairs, he felt the adrenaline begin to fade, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. He looked out at the old lighthouse. The storm was finally breaking. A thin line of pale grey light was appearing on the eastern horizon. Morning was coming to Blue Island. Mr. Green stood next to Peter, watching the sunrise. "You're a good journalist, Mr. Miller. You didn't just find the story. You finished it." "It wasn't just me," Peter said, nodding toward Marco and the manager. "We all played our part." The sun rose fully over Blue Island, painting the sky in shades of soft pink and gold. The violent storm of the night before had left the air feeling scrubbed and clean. On the hotel lawn, the investigators were busy. They had found the location Peter saw from his window, the site near the old oak tree where the ground had been disturbed. There, beneath the roots, they found the truth, the remains of the two guards from 20 years ago. Peter stood on the dock, watching the last of the evidence crates being loaded onto the Coast Guard cutter. Among them were the heavy bars of gold, recovered from the sea cave beneath the lighthouse. They looked ordinary in the morning light, just heavy blocks of metal that had caused so much misery. Mrs. Gable walked down the dock to join Peter. She looked different today. The heavy, expensive jewelry was gone, and she wore a simple white sweater. The shadows under her eyes were still there, but the look of constant, biting fear had vanished. "I am leaving the island today, Peter," she said. "I've sold the property to a nature trust. They will turn the hotel into a research center and keep the forest protected. It's better this way. The island deserves to be a place of life, not a tomb for secrets." "And what will you do?" Peter asked. "I'm going to find the families of those two young men," she said quietly. "The guards. I cannot bring them back, but I can make sure their names are cleared and their families are cared for. It is the only way to truly pay the debt." She handed Peter a small, leather-bound box. "Open it when you are back on the mainland." 1 month later, Peter sat at his desk in his small apartment. His typewriter was clicking steadily. On the wall above his desk, he had pinned a photograph Marco had taken, a shot of the four of them standing on the roof as the sun came up. He opened the box Mrs. Gable had given him. Inside was the silver owl ring that had once belonged to her husband. A note was tucked beneath it. "To the man who looks for the truth even when the lights go out. Thank you for the light." Peter turned back to his typewriter and typed the final words of his article. He didn't focus on the gold or the heist. He focused on the weight of secrets and the courage it takes to let them go. He titled the piece, "The Ghost of Blue Island, A Story of Debt and Redemption." As he pulled the final page from the machine, he looked out his window at the city. The mystery of the island was over, but he knew that as long as there were shadows, there would always be a need for someone to bring the light. The publication of The Ghost of Blue Island changed Peter Miller's life overnight. What was supposed to be a small human interest piece for a local paper was picked up by the national syndicates. Peter's face was on television, his name was in every bookstore, and the journalist who caught a killer became a household name. But as the fame grew, so did a cold sense of unease. Peter sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of fan mail and legal documents, but his eyes kept drifting to the silver owl ring on his desk. The trial of Dr. Aries and Victor was moving quickly. The evidence Marco had provided was undeniable. However, something in the police reports didn't add up. The authorities had recovered 12 bars of gold from the sea cave, but according to the old manifest Peter had seen in the black logbook, there should have been 24. 12 bars, millions of dollars, were still missing. The police assumed they had been lost to the sea during the crash 20 years ago. But Peter remembered the look on Victor's face when the freighter didn't appear. It wasn't just fear. It was the look of a man who had been betrayed by a partner. On a rainy Tuesday morning, a month after the rescue, Peter received a telephone call that stopped his heart. It was not from a fan or a lawyer. It was from the Blackwood Penitentiary, the high-security facility where Victor was being held. The officer on the other end was brief. "The prisoner, Victor Vance, is asking for you, Mr. Miller. He says he has information regarding the missing half of the debt. He says he will only speak to the man who threw the book." Peter felt a familiar prickle of adrenaline. He knew he should stay away. He had done his job. The case was closed. But the journalist in him, the part that couldn't leave a loose thread, was already reaching for his coat. He looked at the silver owl ring. In the grey morning light, the owl's eyes seemed to flash. Was it a warning or an invitation? He arrived at the prison 2 hours later. The grey stone walls of Blackwood felt like a grim echo of the Gable Manor. After passing through 3 security checkpoints, Peter was led into a small, glass-walled room. Victor sat on the other side. He looked older, his skin sallow and his hair thinning. He no longer looked like the arrogant pilot who had threatened Peter on the roof. He looked like a man haunted by something far worse than a prison sentence. "You came," Victor said, his voice a dry rattle. "You said you had information about the gold." Peter replied, sitting down. Victor leaned closer to the glass. "Aries and I were just the muscle. Peter, we took the gold from the plane. Yes. But we didn't bring it to the island. We were meeting someone. Someone who has been watching you since you left that rock." Victor's eyes darted toward the guard standing by the heavy steel door. He lowered his voice until it was a mere vibration against the glass. "You think Eleanor Gable was the one in charge? She was just the vault. Peter. She held the assets because her name carried the weight of respectability. But the gold, the real weight, belonged to someone else. We call him the broker." Peter felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air-conditioned prison room. "The broker? You told the police it was a private heist. You said you and Aries acted alone after the crash. We told them what they wanted to hear so they'd stop digging." Victor hissed, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the table. "If we mentioned him, we wouldn't survive the first night in our cells. But something changed. I saw the news. I saw that you have the owl ring. Do you have any idea what that ring actually represents? It's not a family crest, kid. It's a key." Peter looked down at his hand, though he wasn't wearing the ring. He kept it in the leather box at home. "A key to what?" "To the other 12 bars." Victor said. "They aren't on the island. They never were. When the plane went down, the cargo was split. Aries and I took the 12 that the police found. But the other half, the half meant for the buyers, it was intercepted before we even hit the water. The broker has been waiting 20 years to finish the transaction, and now he thinks you know where the rest of the payment is hidden." Victor leaned back, his face suddenly pale. "Check your mail, Peter. Not the fan mail. Look for the envelope with the wax seal of a blindfolded lion. If you see it, don't open it. Run." The guard stepped forward, signaling that the session was over. Victor was pulled from his chair, but he shouted over his shoulder as he was led away. "He's not in a cell, Peter. He's in the room with you." Peter walked out of the prison into a sudden downpour. The rain felt heavy and suffocating. As he reached his car, he stopped. Tucked under his windshield wiper was a small, cream-colored envelope. It was damp from the rain, but the seal was perfectly intact. It wasn't an owl. It was a lion, its eyes covered by a thick band of wax. He didn't open it. He sat in the driver's seat, his heart racing, and looked into his rearview mirror. A black sedan was parked across the street, its engine idling. The windows were tinted so dark they looked like polished obsidian. Peter realized then that the story hadn't ended on the roof of Gable Manor. It had only just reached the second act. The hidden debt wasn't paid. It had simply changed hands. He put the car in gear and drove, his mind spinning with Victor's words. "He's in the room with you." The rain lashed against the windshield, turning the city lights into blurred smears of neon. Peter Miller drove with his eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. The black sedan remained 2 cars behind, a persistent shadow in the deluge. It didn't try to overtake him. It simply existed, a silent observer marking his every turn. Peter knew better than to go straight back to his apartment. If Victor was right, his home was no longer the sanctuary it once was. He executed a series of sharp turns through the narrow back streets of the industrial district, finally pulling into the parking lot of an all-night diner. The Starlight Grill was a place of flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee, a perfect spot to disappear in plain sight. He grabbed the damp envelope and the silver owl ring from his glove box and stepped out into the rain. Inside the diner, Peter chose a booth in the far corner, positioned so he could see both the front entrance and the kitchen exit. He ordered a black coffee he didn't intend to drink and waited until the waitress walked away. His hands were steady, but his mind was a whirlwind. He looked at the cream-colored envelope. The wax of the blindfolded lion felt cold and hard under his thumb. With a deep breath, he used a butter knife to carefully pry the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy vellum and a photograph. Peter's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the image. It was a high-angle shot of him on the roof of Gable Manor, taken at the exact moment he had thrown the notebook. But the angle was impossible. It hadn't been taken from the ground or the sea. It had been taken from the lighthouse, from a vantage point higher than where he and Mr. Green had stood. Someone else had been in the lantern room that night, watching the entire climax unfold from above Mr. Green and the others. He turned his attention to the letter. The text was not written in ink but was composed of letters cut from various newspapers, a classic but effective method of anonymity. The owl sees the past, but the lion guards the future. The 12 bars you found were a sacrifice. The 12 that remain are the prize. You hold the key in your hand. Miller. The broker is coming to collect his interest. Peter looked at the silver owl ring sitting on the formica table. Victor had called it a key. He picked it up and examined it under the harsh diner lights. He had looked at it 1,000 times. But now he noticed something he had missed before. The eyes of the owl weren't just decorative stones. They were tiny, polished lenses. He held the ring up to the light of the neon open sign. As the light passed through the tiny lenses, it projected a faint, complex pattern of lines onto the surface of his white napkin. It was a map, not of Blue Island, but of a vault layout. A sudden movement at the diner's entrance made him jump. A man in a long, wet trench coat walked in, shaking an umbrella. He didn't look at Peter. He sat at the counter and ordered a meal. But through the window, Peter saw the black sedan pull into the lot, its headlights finally cutting off. He was being boxed in. Peter's pulse thrummed in his fingertips as he stared at the projection on the napkin. The pattern of lines was precise, a skeletal blueprint of a structure built with layers of security. He recognized the shape of a circular chamber, flanked by thick walls that could only represent a reinforced vault. In the center of the projection, a small X shimmered, etched into the light by a flaw or a deliberate mark within the owl's stone eyes. "Is everything all right, sugar?" the waitress asked. reappearing with a glass of water. Peter quickly folded the napkin and shoved the ring into his pocket. "Fine. Thank you. Just calculating some expenses." She nodded, though her eyes lingered on the cream-colored envelope for a second too long. As she turned away, Peter caught a glimpse of the man at the counter. The man had removed his hat. He was bald, with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jawline, a mark that looked like a lightning bolt. He wasn't eating. He was watching Peter's reflection in the mirror behind the pie display. Peter knew he couldn't stay. He left a $5 bill on the table and stood up, sliding toward the kitchen exit instead of the front door. He moved through the swinging doors, ignoring the confused shout of a dishwasher, and burst out into the alleyway. The rain had turned into a freezing sleet. He ran. He didn't head for his car. The black sedan was parked right next to it. Instead, he wove through the labyrinth of dumpsters and industrial crates, his heart hammering. He needed a phone, but not his own. His own was likely tapped. 2 blocks away, he found a battered payphone outside a closed hardware store. He dialed a number he had memorized long ago, the private line of Marco, the chef. "Hello." Marco's voice sounded groggy, then suddenly sharp. "Peter. Is that you?" "Marco, listen to me." Peter hissed, glancing at the street corner. "The owl ring. It's a projector. It shows a map of a vault. Victor told me about someone called the Broker. I think he's following me right now." "The Broker." Marco's voice went quiet, filled with a dread Peter had never heard before, even on the island. "Peter, get out of the city. If you have that map, you have the location of the Continental Reserve, the place where the gold was supposed to go before it was diverted to the island." "Where is it?" "Marco." "It's not in a bank." Marco whispered. "It's under the old Museum of Antiquities. The Gables were the primary donors. They built the museum as a cover for the vault. If the Broker is moving, it means the 20-year timer on the lock is about to expire." Suddenly, the line went dead. Not a dial tone, just a cold, empty silence. Peter looked up. The black sedan was idling at the end of the alley. The man with the lightning bolt scar was standing under a street lamp 20 yards away, holding a pair of heavy wire cutters. He smiled, the scar twisting his face into a mask of mockery. "The map, Mr. Miller." The man called out. "Or we can do this the difficult way." Peter didn't wait for the man with the scar to take another step. The wire cutters snapped shut with a chilling, metallic clack that echoed against the damp brick walls. As the man lunged, Peter pivoted, grabbing a heavy, rusted metal trash lid and swinging it with desperate force. It didn't hit the man, but it struck a stack of wooden pallets, sending them cascading into the pursuer's path. "You're out of your league, Miller," the scarred man yelled, stumbling over the splintered wood. Peter didn't look back. He sprinted toward the far end of the alley, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He dove between 2 parked delivery trucks and rolled onto the main street, where the sleet was turning the pavement into a treacherous mirror. A yellow taxi was slowing down at a red light. Peter threw himself toward the door, yanking it open. The old Museum of Antiquities. "Fast!" Peter gasped, slamming the door. The driver, a man with a thick beard and a bored expression, looked at Peter's disheveled state through the mirror. "It's closed, pal. Past midnight." "I don't care. Just go." Peter shoved a $20 bill through the partition. As the taxi pulled away, Peter looked through the rear window. The black sedan was already swinging out of the alley, its headlights cutting through the dark like the eyes of a predator. The chase was no longer silent. It was a race against time and a shadow that had been growing for 20 years. The old Museum of Antiquities loomed out of the fog like a Greek temple displaced in time. Its massive granite columns and silent marble statues stood as guardians of the secrets buried beneath. Peter hopped out before the taxi had even fully stopped, running toward the side entrance used by staff. He knew the museum's layout from a piece he had written years ago on its architecture. He reached the heavy bronze door and fumbled with the silver owl ring. He didn't have a key, but he remembered the projection. The X on the napkin hadn't just been in the center of a room. It had been aligned with a specific architectural feature. He looked up at the pediment above the door. A stone carving of an owl stared back at him. Peter held the ring up, allowing the dim street lamplight to pass through the lenses. The projected lines appeared on the bronze door, shifting as he moved his hand. Suddenly, the lines snapped into place, aligning perfectly with the decorative filigree of the metalwork. A faint click vibrated through the handle. The Gables hadn't just built a museum. They had built a giant, mechanical puzzle. He slipped inside, the air immediately turning still and smelling of floor wax and ancient stone. The grand hall was a cavern of shadows. Peter moved quickly, his footsteps muffled by the thick runners. He reached the center of the hall, where a massive statue of a blindfolded lion, the same symbol from the wax seal, sat on a pedestal. The lion guards the future, Peter whispered, his breath hitching. He knelt at the base of the statue. He looked for the mechanism, the lever, the secret. But as he searched, the heavy front doors of the museum groaned. A sliver of light cut through the hall. The man with the scar had arrived. The grand hall was a vast, cold echo. Peter ducked behind the massive pedestal of the blindfolded lion, pressing his back against the cool marble. The heavy bronze front doors were pushed open from the outside. The sound of boots on stone followed, slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly confident. "I know you're in here, Miller." The man with the scar called out. His voice bounced off the high vaulted ceilings, making it sound like it was coming from every direction at once. "You're a journalist, not a thief. You don't know how these systems work. You're going to trip a silent alarm, and then neither of us gets what we want." Peter ignored him, his eyes frantically scanning the base of the statue. The projection from the owl ring had shown an X right here, at the heart of the lion. He looked at the blindfold carved across the lion's stone eyes. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a separate piece of stone, slightly different in color from the rest of the sculpture. He reached up and felt the edges of the stone blindfold. It was cold and smooth, but as he pressed his thumb against the center, he felt a slight give. It was a pressure plate. He pushed harder. A deep, mechanical vibration shuddered through the floor. It wasn't an alarm. It was the sound of ancient gears, kept greased for 20 years, finally turning. The lion didn't move, but the circular floor section surrounding the pedestal began to sink. It was a hidden elevator, a platform designed to carry heavy cargo, or gold, into the depths. "There you are," the man with the scar hissed. He appeared from behind a row of Egyptian sarcophagi, his silhouette sharp against the moonlight streaming through the high windows. He didn't run. He drew a small, silenced pistol from his coat. Peter scrambled onto the sinking platform just as it dropped below the level of the grand hall floor. The man with the scar lunged, his fingers catching the edge of the receding stone. For a horrific second, they stared at each other, the journalist and the mercenary, separated by inches of moving granite. Then, the man lost his grip, and the darkness of the sub-level swallowed Peter whole. The elevator descended into a chamber that smelled of ozone and dry air. As the platform hit the bottom, emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim, amber glow over the room. Peter stood up, brushing the marble dust from his clothes. He was in a reinforced bunker. The walls were lined with heavy steel plating, and in front of him stood the vault door. It was a masterpiece of Victorian engineering, a 3-ton wheel of steel and brass, covered in complex dials and clockwork mechanisms. In the center of the door, where a handle should be, was a small, circular indentation. Peter looked at the owl ring in his hand. The base of the ring was the exact same shape. He realized the ring wasn't just a projector. It was the physical key to the final lock. But as he moved toward the door, he heard a sound from above. The elevator was being called back up. The man with the scar had found the control panel. Peter had less than 60 seconds before he was trapped in a dead-end room with an armed killer. The low hum of the elevator rising was a countdown Peter couldn't ignore. He scrambled to the massive vault door, his boots skidding on the polished steel floor. The amber emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock his frantic movements. He held the silver owl ring between his thumb and forefinger, his hands slick with cold sweat. He pressed the base of the ring into the circular indentation in the center of the vault. It fit with a satisfying, magnetic grip. Nothing happened. "Come on," Peter whispered, his voice cracking. "Turn. Give me something." He looked at the ring. The owl's eyes, the tiny lenses, were aligned horizontally. He remembered the projection on the napkin. The lines had been vertical. He gripped the ring and twisted it 90 degrees. Deep within the door, a series of heavy brass counterweights shifted. A rhythmic mechanical pulse filled the room, sounding like a giant mechanical heartbeat. The outer dials began to spin, their numbers blurred by speed. Suddenly, the 3-ton wheel began to rotate, the massive steel bolts sliding back into the door frame with a sound like a thunderclap. The vault door swung inward, moving with a silent, ghostly grace that defied its weight. Peter stepped inside, and for a moment, he forgot the man with the gun. The room was small, perhaps the size of a walk-in closet, but it was lined from floor to ceiling with velvet-lined shelves. In the center sat the prize, 12 bars of gold, stacked in a perfect pyramid. They glowed with a soft, buttery light, even in the dimness. But next to the gold sat something Peter hadn't expected. It was a stack of files, bound in leather and sealed with the same blindfolded lion wax he had seen earlier. He grabbed the top file and flipped it open. It wasn't a log of payments. It was a list of names. High-ranking government officials, judges, and shipping magnates. The true debt. The gold wasn't just money. It was collateral. The Gables hadn't just been thieves. They had been the bankers for a shadow government. The missing 12 bars were the insurance policy that kept these men in power. A heavy impact echoed from the chamber behind him. The elevator had returned. "Miller!" The man with the scar roared. The sound of his boots hitting the floor was closer now. Peter looked around the vault. There were no windows, no back doors. It was a tomb. But then he saw it, a small ventilation grate near the ceiling, barely wide enough for a man to crawl through. Next to it was a manual override lever for the door. If he closed the door from the inside, he'd be trapped. But if he timed it right, he could trap the man with the scar outside while he escaped through the vents. "Checkmate," Peter muttered. He grabbed the files and 2 bars of gold, all he could carry, and leaped for the grate. As the scarred man rounded the corner, his gun leveled, Peter yanked the override lever. The 3-ton door began to slam shut. The massive vault door didn't just close. It surged, a silent predator of steel hungry for its frame. The man with the scar screamed, a sound of pure, primal fury, and fired his pistol. The bullet sparked harmlessly off the reinforced casing of the door just as the gap narrowed to a sliver. Peter, clinging to the edge of the ventilation duct, saw one last glimpse of the man's face. Not just angry, but terrified. The man knew that failing the broker was a death sentence far slower than being locked in a vault. With a final, bone-shaking impact, the vault sealed. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy weight that pressed against Peter's eardrums. He was hanging 4 feet above the floor, his fingers white-knuckled as they gripped the edge of the duct. Below him, the sub-level was now a tomb for his pursuer. Peter shoved the heavy leather files and the 2 gold bars into the shaft ahead of him. The duct was narrow, cold, and smelled of stagnant air and old metal. He hauled himself up, the sharp edges of the galvanized steel biting into his palms. He had to move. The manual override would hold for a while, but a man like the scarred mercenary would eventually find a way to signal his allies. He began to crawl. The sound of his own breathing was deafening in the confined space. Every few feet, the duct branched or dipped, a metal intestines designed to breathe for the museum. Peter followed the faint draft of cool air, knowing it led to the exterior. As he moved, he couldn't stop thinking about the names in the file. He had seen the name of the current governor. He had seen the chief of police. The Blindfolded Lion wasn't a secret society. It was a map of corruption that had turned the city into a playground for the wealthy. The Gable family hadn't just been hiding gold. They were holding the leash of every powerful man in the state. Suddenly, the duct beneath him groaned. Peter froze. He was over a vertical drop, a long, dark chimney that led down to the museum's industrial furnace room. He looked at the gold bars. They were heavy, pulling at his center of gravity. If he fell now, he'd be crushed by the very prize he was trying to save. He reached out, his fingers brushing against a loose metal louver. Beyond it, he could see the gray, pre-dawn light of the city. He was near the roofline. With a desperate shove, he kicked the louver out. It fell 3 stories, clattering onto the pavement of a side street. Peter pulled himself out of the hole, gasping as the freezing morning air hit his face. He was on a narrow ledge, 20 feet above the ground. Below him, the black sedan was gone, but a new set of headlights was turning the corner, a sleek, silver limousine. The broker had arrived to inspect the damage. The silver limousine glided to a halt directly beneath the ledge. It didn't belong in this grimy industrial district. Its polished chrome reflected the dumpster fires and the grey slush of the gutters like a misplaced diamond. Peter pressed his chest against the cold stone of the museum wall, the 2 gold bars in his jacket pockets feeling like lead weights threatening to pull him into the abyss. The rear door of the limousine opened. A woman stepped out. She wasn't the shadowy monster Peter had imagined. She was elegant, wearing a tailored navy coat and a silk scarf that fluttered in the wind. She looked like a philanthropist or a high society hostess. But as she looked up, her eyes, cold, sharp, and predatory, locked onto the ventilation grate Peter had just exited. "Mr. Miller," she called out. Her voice was melodic, amplified by the narrow street. "The files you are holding are quite heavy, both in weight and in consequence. They don't belong to you. They are part of a delicate balance that has kept this city running for decades." Peter didn't answer. He looked at the drainage pipe 3 feet to his left. It was rusted, pulling away from the brickwork. But it was his only way down that didn't involve a 3-story drop into a waiting circle of security guards. "I know who you are now," Peter yelled back, his voice shivering. "The names in these files, the Blindfolded Lion. You aren't just protecting gold. You're protecting a list of people who would do anything to keep their secrets." The woman smiled, a thin, bloodless line. "Exactly. Which is why you will never reach a printing press with them. Come down. Peter, let's discuss a settlement. You could have more than just 2 bars. You could have a career that never ends. I prefer the one where I stay alive." Peter shouted. He lunged for the drainage pipe. The metal groaned, a sickening screech of protest as his weight hit it. He slid down, the rust tearing through his gloves and skin. Halfway down, the top bracket snapped. Peter plummeted the remaining 10 feet, landing hard in a pile of salt-crusted snow and trash. The impact jarred his teeth, and for a second, the world went black. "Get him," the woman said, her voice dropping to a flat, icy command. 2 men in black suits stepped from the front of the limo. Peter scrambled to his feet, ignoring the white-hot pain in his ankle. He sprinted toward the mouth of the alley, heading for the one place where a crowd might still exist at this hour, the 4th Street subway station. He burst onto the sidewalk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The station entrance was a glowing hole in the ground 50 yards away. Behind him, the silent electric engine of the limousine hummed as it gave chase, mounting the curb with ruthless efficiency. Peter dove down the stairs, jumping over the turnstile just as the first black-suited guard reached the top of the escalator. He needed to disappear into the veins of the city. But as he reached the platform, he saw the sign. Delayed. Track maintenance. The platform was empty. He was trapped in a neon-lit cage. The subway platform felt like a subterranean cathedral dedicated to silence. The hum of the high-voltage third rail was the only heartbeat in the damp, cold air. Peter stood in the center of the tiles, the 2 gold bars pulling his jacket down, making him feel sluggish. He looked at the empty tracks, the steel rails vanishing into the pitch-black tunnels at either end. The sound of footsteps on the stairs behind him was rhythmic and heavy. The 2 guards from the limousine had arrived. They didn't rush. They moved with the professional confidence of hunters who knew their prey had reached a dead end. "The files, Mr. Miller," one of the men said, his voice echoing flatly against the tiled walls. "Give them to us, and you can walk out of here. The woman in the car, she's a woman of her word. Her word involves a shallow grave in the Pine Barrens. I suspect." Peter replied, backing away toward the edge of the platform. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold, hard edges of the silver owl ring. He realized he still had the key to the vault. As long as he had the ring and the files, he was the only bridge to the truth. Suddenly, a distant vibration began to shake the floor. It wasn't a passenger train. It was the low, grinding growl of a maintenance vehicle. A yellow work light flickered in the northern tunnel. Peter looked at the gap between the platform and the tracks. It was a 4-foot drop. Dangerous, but manageable. "Don't even think about it," the second guard warned, reaching into his coat. Peter didn't think. He acted on pure instinct. He turned and leaped into the darkness of the tracks. He landed hard on the gravel, the impact vibrating through his already injured ankle. He scrambled toward the center, staying clear of the deadly third rail. The maintenance car was getting closer, its massive iron wheels screeching against the curves. "He's on the tracks," one of the guards shouted. Peter looked up and saw a small maintenance door, a bolt hole, built into the side of the tunnel wall. These were used by workers to avoid oncoming trains. He lunged for it, throwing the heavy files inside first. He pulled himself into the narrow alcove just as the maintenance car roared past, a blur of yellow steel and sparks. The wind from the train nearly sucked him back out, but he held onto the cold stone. As the tail lights of the car faded, Peter didn't go back to the platform. He followed the narrow emergency catwalk deeper into the tunnel. He knew these tunnels eventually led to the old ghost stations, stops that had been closed for 50 years. If he could reach the City Hall ghost station, he might find a way back to the surface that the Blindfolded Lion hadn't considered. He moved quickly, his hand tracing the damp, slime-covered wall. Behind him, he heard a muffled curse. The guards were coming down onto the tracks. The chase was moving into the arteries of the city. The air in the tunnels was stagnant, thick with the smell of iron filings and ancient dust. Peter moved along the narrow concrete ledge, his shoulder brushing against the curved brickwork of the original 1904 construction. The further he walked, the more the modern subway's fluorescent hum faded, replaced by a heavy, velvet silence. Behind him, the distant beams of high-powered flashlights cut through the dark, sweeping across the soot-stained walls. The guards were cautious, but they were closing in. They knew he was weighed down. The gold bars in his pockets clinked rhythmically against the stone, a metallic dinner bell for his pursuers. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up. The narrow catwalk gave way to a wide, curving platform adorned with ornate terracotta tiles and dust-covered chandeliers. This was the City Hall ghost station, a masterpiece of arched ceilings and skylights that had been sealed off for decades. The glass in the ceiling was thick with street grime, allowing only the faintest, ghostly purple glow of the city's night to filter through. Peter scrambled onto the platform, his boots kicking up clouds of fine grey powder. In the center of the hall stood a beautiful brass and glass ticket booth, now shattered and empty. He ran toward the grand staircase, but a quick glance upward told him the exit was welded shut with heavy steel plates. He was in a beautiful, ornate cage. "Mr. Miller." A voice echoed through the tunnel. It wasn't a guard. It was the woman from the limousine. She had entered the tunnel system from a different point. She stood on the far end of the platform, her navy coat looking black in the gloom. "You've led us on a fascinating tour of our city's history. But even the finest tunnels have an end." Peter backed away, his heels hitting the edge of a decorative fountain that hadn't seen water in half a century. "The history of this city is written in blood and gold, isn't it? The Gables weren't just bankers. They were the architects of this whole mess. The Gables were visionaries," she replied, stepping into the dim light of a skylight. "They understood that power requires a foundation. That gold in your pocket. It was meant to fund the reconstruction of the harbor. The files. They are the social contracts that keep our leaders honest." "Honest?" Peter laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "They're blackmail files. Every name in here has a price tag." He looked at the files in his hand. Then, he looked at the 2 gold bars. He realized he couldn't win a physical fight, and he couldn't outrun them forever. But he was a journalist. He knew how to distribute information. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small, portable satellite transmitter, a tool he always carried for remote filings. In this deep underground station, the signal was weak, but the skylights above offered a thin line of sight to the sky. "I'm uploading the index of the files to a cloud server, Madam Broker," Peter said, holding the device high. "In 60 seconds, the names of every member of the Blindfolded Lion will be in the hands of 3 major newsrooms. You can kill me, but you can't kill the signal." The woman's face hardened. The mask of elegance slipped, revealing a terrifying, raw desperation. "Kill him," she whispered, "before the bar reaches 100%. The 2 guards lunged forward, their polished Oxfords skidding on the dust-covered tiles. The woman, the broker, stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the flickering blue light of Peter's satellite transmitter. It was a race between the digital and the physical, the modern world of data versus the ancient world of violence. Peter scrambled back toward the center of the platform, holding the transmitter high toward the glass skylights. The signal bar on the tiny screen pulsed. 65%, 72%. "The glass!" the lead guard shouted, reaching for his weapon. "He's using the line of sight." A silenced shot hissed through the air, shattering a terracotta vase inches from Peter's head. Peter dove behind the heavy brass and glass ticket booth. Shards of century-old glass rained down on him like diamonds. He looked at the screen. 81%. The upload was slowing down. The thick grime on the skylights was choking the signal. "It's too slow, Peter," the broker called out, her voice echoing with a chilling calmness. "Even in the digital age, physics is a cruel mistress. You're in a hole. You're in the dark. And we are very, very fast." Peter reached into his pocket and pulled out one of the gold bars. It was heavy, cold, and worth more than his life. He didn't use it as a bribe. He used it as a tool. With a grunt of effort, he hurled the gold bar upward. It flew through the air, a yellow arc of solid wealth, and crashed through the center of the arched skylight. The glass exploded. A sudden shaft of crisp, cold night air and unobstructed moonlight flooded the station. The signal bar on the transmitter jumped instantly. 92%, 98%. Upload complete. Peter didn't wait to celebrate. He shoved the transmitter and the remaining files into his bag and bolted for the far end of the station. He knew the guards would be on him in seconds. But the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't just a man with a secret anymore. He was a man who had already shared it. He's done it. The second guard yelled, firing a volley of shots that pockmarked the beautiful arches of the ceiling. Peter reached a maintenance door that looked less reinforced than the others. He slammed his shoulder into it, the rusted bolt snapping with a sharp crack. He tumbled into a secondary tunnel, one that smelled of saltwater and wet coal. This wasn't a subway line. It was an old utility crawl space used for the city's steam pipes. As he scrambled through the narrow opening, he looked back. The broker was standing in the center of the ghost station, bathed in the light from the broken skylight. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her phone. The notification had already hit the wires. The names were out. The Blindfolded Lion was being unmasked in real time across the globe. Her empire was crumbling. But her expression didn't change. She simply raised her hand and pointed toward the steam tunnel. "Finish it," she commanded. "Gold or no gold, he doesn't leave the ground." The steam tunnel was a blistering contrast to the cold, stagnant air of the ghost station. Thick, asbestos-wrapped pipes ran along the walls like the veins of a giant beast, hissing and groaning under the pressure of the city's early morning heating cycle. Peter scrambled through the narrow space, his clothes soaking with sweat and condensation within seconds. The weight of the remaining gold bar and the thick leather files made his movements clumsy, but the adrenaline kept his legs moving. Behind him, the maintenance door groaned as the guards forced their way through. He could hear the metallic scrape of their weapons against the pipe casings. They were coming fast, their silhouettes illuminated by the flickering orange glow of a leaking steam valve. "You have nowhere to go, Miller," one of the guards shouted, his voice muffled by the roar of the pipes. "This tunnel dead ends at the river filtration plant. You're just crawling into a boiler." Peter didn't stop. He saw a series of heavy brass valves ahead, labeled with faded red numbers. He remembered his father, a city engineer, talking about the steam system. It was a delicate balance of pressure. If one valve was tampered with, the entire section could become a wall of scalding white fog. He reached a large master wheel. He set the satellite transmitter and the files down and gripped the metal. It was searingly hot. Using the tail of his jacket as a glove, he heaved against the wheel. It didn't budge. He braced his feet against the brick wall and gave one final, desperate tug. The valve turned. A jet of superheated steam erupted from a bypass pipe 20 feet behind him, right between Peter and the advancing guards. The tunnel was instantly filled with a blinding, roaring cloud of white. Peter heard the guards shout in surprise and pain as they were forced to retreat from the sudden heat. He grabbed his things and continued his crawl. The tunnel began to slope upward. The smell of saltwater grew stronger, mixed with the sharp scent of river silt. He was nearing the filtration plant on the edge of the East River. Through the thick haze of steam, he saw a vertical ladder leading to a circular hatch. Peter climbed, his muscles screaming. He shoved the hatch open and pulled himself out onto a concrete pier. The cool morning air felt like a miracle. He was outside, standing under the massive iron span of a bridge, the river churning below in the grey light of dawn. But he wasn't alone. Standing at the end of the pier, silhouetted against the rising sun, was the silver limousine. The broker had driven to the exit point. She stood by the open door, a small, silver-plated pistol in her hand. She wasn't looking at him with anger anymore. She looked at him with a cold, professional curiosity. "The upload is finished, Peter," she said, her voice barely audible over the river. "The names are public. My life is over. But your story still needs an ending. And I've always preferred a tragedy." She raised the pistol, aiming directly at his heart. Peter looked at the gold bar in his hand, then at the deep, dark water of the river. He had one move left. The sun finally crested the horizon, a brilliant sliver of fire that turned the East River into a sheet of hammered copper. The broker stood at the end of the pier, her silver pistol steady, her eyes reflecting the dawn with a vacant, icy brilliance. Peter Miller stood 20 feet away, the wind off the water whipping his tattered jacket. He was covered in soot, flour, and the salt of the Atlantic, but he held the leather files to his chest like a shield. The names are already on every news desk from here to London. Peter said, his voice raw but unwavering. The Blindfolded Lion is dead. Even if you pull that trigger, you're just shooting at a ghost. Perhaps. The woman replied, her finger tightening on the trigger. But ghosts don't testify. Without you to verify the origin of these files, my lawyers will turn your truth into a conspiracy theory by lunch. The gold. Peter. Throw the last bar and the files into the river, and I might let you jump. Peter looked down at the remaining gold bar in his hand. It was the physical manifestation of 20 years of greed, murder, and hidden debts. He looked at the silver owl ring, the key that had started it all. He realized that as long as these objects existed, the cycle would continue. You're right, Peter said quietly. The story needs an ending. With a sudden, explosive motion, Peter didn't dive for cover. He lunged toward the edge of the pier, but instead of jumping, he hurled the gold bar, not into the water, but directly at the woman's feet. As she instinctively flinched, Peter threw the leather files into the air. The wind caught the pages. Hundreds of documents, the proof of a generation's corruption, erupted like a cloud of white birds. They swirled in the morning gale, scattering across the pier, the river, and the streets beyond. At the same moment, the distant wail of sirens began to rise from the city. Police, federal agents, and the press, all converging on the coordinates Peter's transmitter had broadcast. The broker looked at the falling papers, her composure finally shattering. She reached out to grab a drifting page, her pistol wavering. In that second of distraction, a heavy hand landed on her shoulder. It was Mr. Green. The manager of Blue Island had arrived with the first wave of authorities. He had followed the signal, his face set in the same grim determination he had shown on the lighthouse roof. Behind him, Marco and a dozen officers swarmed the pier. The debt is settled, Mr. Green said, his voice like iron. The woman dropped the pistol. It clattered onto the concrete, a useless toy against the weight of the evidence falling from the sky. The officers moved in, and the Madam Broker was led away in silence, her silk scarf trailing in the dirt. Peter slumped against a rusted mooring post. He watched as the last of the files settled on the water, drifting away toward the sea. Marco walked over and handed him a thermos of hot coffee. You did it, Peter, Marco said, looking at the sunrise. The whole world knows now. They know the names. Peter replied, taking a slow sip. But the gold is back where it belongs, at the bottom of the story. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver owl ring. He looked at it one last time, then tossed it into the deep, churning water of the East River. It vanished without a splash. 1 year later, Peter Miller sat in a new office. It wasn't a cramped newspaper cubicle. It was a quiet room overlooking a park. On his desk sat a Pulitzer Prize and a framed photograph of a lighthouse on a rocky island. He had finished his book, The Weight of Gold. It wasn't just a bestseller. It had triggered a national reform. Mrs. Gable had moved to a small cottage in the countryside, finally at peace. Marco had opened his own restaurant, named The Lantern. Peter pulled a fresh sheet of paper into his typewriter. He wasn't writing about conspiracies or gold anymore. He was writing about the morning sun. He smiled, his fingers hitting the keys with a steady, rhythmic confidence. The mystery of Blue Island was over.